She had written checks that moved markets, fired executives without blinking, and stood in rooms where presidents asked for her opinion. But the night a stranger looked her dead in the eyes, in her ballroom, at her event, and told her to be quiet and follow him, she did it, without hesitation, without condition, and it destroyed every wall she had spent 30 years building. This is the story of Vanessa Hale and Mason Reed, two people who had already saved each other once without knowing it, and were about to do it again in ways neither of them was prepared for. Drop your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. And stay until the end. You'll want to. The invitation had been a mistake. Not in the criminal sense, not in the dramatic sense, just in the small, humiliating way that certain things happen to people who are already running on empty. A warehouse coworker named Doug had won 2 tickets to the Hargrove Foundation Gala through some radio station contest he'd entered drunk, decided his wife wouldn't want to sit through 3 hours of speeches, and handed one to Mason on a Thursday afternoon like he was offering a stick of gum. Black tie thing, Doug had said, not looking up from his locker. Downtown, free food. Figure you and the kid could use a night out. Mason had almost said no. He'd said no to most things for the past 4 years. It was easier that way, required less energy, produced fewer complications. But Emma had been standing right there, still in her school backpack, and the way her face had changed when she heard the words free food and downtown and night out. That expression, that brief electric flash of pure kid excitement, had made saying no feel like a crime. So here they were. The Grand Meridian Hotel on Fifth Avenue looked, from the outside, like it had been designed specifically to make people like Mason feel bad about themselves. Floodlights cut upward along columns of white marble. A red carpet stretched from the lobby doors to the curb, flanked by photographers and women in gowns that probably cost more than Mason's truck. Valets moved with the fluid choreography of people who understood that wealthy guests should never have to wait for anything. Not for a cab, not for a drink, not for someone to take their coat. Mason parked 4 blocks away because he couldn't afford the valet. Emma walked beside him holding his hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his larger ones. She was wearing her nicest dress, a yellow one with white flowers that she'd picked out herself at Target 18 months ago and had since refused to replace despite the fact that the hem was unraveling at one corner. She had fixed her own hair for the occasion, 2 lopsided pigtails held in place by mismatched scrunchies, one purple, one with a cartoon cat on it. She looked, Mason thought, absolutely perfect. He looked like he'd borrowed a suit from a man 4 inches shorter than him, which he had. Doug's formal jacket pulled tight across Mason's shoulders and left 2 inches of shirt cuff showing below each sleeve. His tie was the same one he'd worn to his wife's funeral and 2 job interviews since then, a dark navy stripe that had faded to something closer to gray. He'd shined his shoes himself that afternoon using an actual can of black polish he'd found in the back of the closet. And he'd nicked the side of his jaw shaving and covered it with a small piece of toilet paper that he'd removed 3 times and replaced twice before finally leaving it off and hoping no one noticed the dried blood. "Daddy," Emma said, staring up at the hotel entrance. "Are we in trouble?" "No, Bug. We're guests." "Guests of who?" "Guests of the Hargrove Foundation." "Who's that?" "Rich people who give money to other people." Emma considered this. "Are we the people they give money to, or the people they take it from?" Mason looked down at her. "What kind of question is that?" "I heard you talking to Doug about it. He said something about donors." "Donors give money." "So are we donors?" "We're guests." "That's different." She narrowed her eyes at him with that expression she'd inherited directly from her mother. Slightly skeptical, entirely too perceptive for her age. "Do we have to give any money?" "We don't have any money, so no." "Good," Emma said, and marched forward toward the entrance like she owned it. Don't. The inside of the Grand Meridian was, in the most literal sense, the most beautiful room Mason had entered in years. He used to attend hospital galas in another life, fundraising events for the pediatric unit, research dinners, the annual charity auction that Dr. Harlan used to drag the whole department to every February. But that was before. That was when he wore suits that fit and had a wife to straighten his tie, and a title that gave him permission to be in rooms like this without feeling like a fraud. Now he stood just inside the main ballroom entrance and felt the specific social pain of a man who understood exactly how out of place he was. The room was enormous. High ceilings hung with cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured light across hundreds of guests in formal wear. Round tables draped in white linen filled the center floor, each one decorated with tall floral arrangements that Mason guessed cost more than a week of his groceries. Waitstaff moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and small appetizers. A string quartet played somewhere near the far wall, nearly drowned out by the low, rolling hum of wealthy conversation. Emma pressed herself against his leg. "It smells like flowers," she whispered. "It does." And something else. "Money," Mason said, and immediately regretted it because Emma repeated it loudly enough for a woman in a silver gown nearby to glance over with raised eyebrows. Mason offered a tight smile and steered Emma firmly in the opposite direction. They found seats at a table near the back, not specifically assigned to them, but clearly the table where you put the guests who didn't quite fit with the others. There was a retired school teacher named Dolores who'd won a raffle, a young couple from New Jersey who seemed as confused as Mason about why they were there, and a heavy-set man named Gerald, who turned out to work in the hotel's maintenance division and had been strongly encouraged by his manager to attend as part of the staff appreciation gesture. Gerald shook Mason's hand and immediately said, "Open bars in the back. I already checked." "Good to know," Mason said. Emma ate 2 bread rolls and a plate of something that turned out to be scallops, which she announced were weird but okay. She drew pictures on the back of the program using a pen she'd pulled from Mason's jacket pocket without asking. She asked Dolores 17 questions about her cats. She kicked her feet against her chair legs in a rhythmic pattern that was not quite loud enough to be a problem, but was absolutely constant. Mason drank water and watched the room. He'd spent a lot of years learning how to be somewhere without really being there, how to hold himself still and quiet, while the world moved around him. It was something he'd developed during the worst stretch, the 18 months when Sarah was sick, and the world had gone gray and thick, and every day was a series of tasks to complete, rather than experiences to have. You got very good at watching other people love when you were just trying to survive. So he watched. He watched the cluster of men near the bar who talked with the comfortable loudness of people who expected to be overheard. He watched the foundation's director work the room with handshakes and practiced laughs. He watched the waitstaff with the particular attention of someone who had worked service jobs, the way they managed their trays, the slight tension in the shoulders of the ones who'd been on their feet for 4 hours already. And then, without quite meaning to, he noticed the woman. She was standing at the far end of the room near a set of tall windows, not mingling, not working the crowd, just standing there with a glass of water. Not champagne, he noticed, looking out at the skyline beyond the glass. She was wearing a dark green dress that probably had a designer name Mason wouldn't recognize, and her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but definitely wasn't. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't performing. She was just there, watching the room the same way he was watching it. He would have noticed her regardless. She was striking in a way that didn't require effort. But what actually caught his attention was the expression on her face. She looked exhausted in the way that sleep couldn't fix. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror for 3 years. He looked away. Emma had finished drawing and was now examining the centerpiece flowers with intense scientific interest, gently pressing one finger against a petal and then pulling it back. "Is it real?" she asked him. "Probably. How can you tell?" "The edges aren't perfect. Real things are never completely perfect." She looked up at him with that same slightly skeptical expression. "You're real, and you're pretty perfect." Mason blinked. The unexpected sincerity of it caught him completely off guard, the way Emma's honest moments sometimes did, just walking up and landing like a small, perfect punch right in the center of his chest. He cleared his throat. "I'm very far from perfect, Bug." "That's what I mean," she said, and went back to examining the flowers. He was still smiling about that when Emma went quiet in a way that was wrong. Not the comfortable quiet of a child engrossed in something interesting. A different kind of quiet, sudden, absolute, with a quality to it that Mason had learned years ago, first in medical training and then again in the most frightening education of his life: fatherhood. He turned. Emma was sitting very still in her chair. Her small hand had come up to her throat. Bug. Her eyes found his. They were wide and starting to water. My throat, she said. Her voice was strange, thickened, slightly strangled. Daddy, my throat feels... He was out of his chair before she finished the sentence. The scallops! He should have thought about the scallops. Emma had a shellfish allergy that had been flagged as moderate in her pediatric records, which meant manageable with caution, not the severe kind, except that the definition of moderate had apparently just shifted tonight because the way Emma's lips were beginning to swell and the wet, labored sound of her breathing were not moderate things. He had her standing, his hands on her face, checking her airway in the automatic muscle memory way that never fully left certain kinds of training. Her color was still okay, not blue, not gray, but the hives were already rising on her neck, and her eyes were wet with fear that she was working very hard not to express as panic. I've got you, he said, low and steady. You hear me? I've got you. I need you to breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that? She nodded, eyes locked on his. Good. Keep doing that. He turned, scanning the room. Does anyone have an epinephrine auto-injector? EpiPen? The table went still. Gerald blinked. Dolores pressed a hand to her chest. The couple from New Jersey looked at each other. I need an EpiPen, Mason said, louder now, enough to turn heads at the surrounding tables. My daughter is having an allergic reaction. Does anyone have epinephrine? A murmur moved through the nearby crowd. Someone said something about finding the event coordinator. Someone else suggested calling 911. A waiter appeared looking uncertain, and Mason turned to him with the precise, controlled authority he used to deploy in emergency situations, the tone he'd spent years developing and then thought he'd lost. Not loud, not frantic, but absolutely clear and completely non-negotiable. Get me your event medical kit, right now. Don't ask anyone. Go. The waiter went. Emma was breathing harder. She reached up and found Mason's forearm and held on with both hands, her grip tight and trusting, and the combination of that grip and the sound of her struggling and the memories it dragged up. Other rooms, other crises, the particular quality of helplessness that had characterized the worst years of his life, forced Mason to make a choice right there between the fear and the function. He chose function, the way he always did. He scooped her up, one arm under her knees, one behind her back, and started moving toward the hallway, off the main ballroom. There would be a service area, a catering kitchen, something with a first aid kit. He was almost to the doorway when he walked directly into a woman coming the other way. Vanessa Hale had left the main ballroom for the first time in 90 minutes because her head was beginning to split, and she needed 30 seconds of silence before she smiled through one more conversation with one more man who was either trying to impress her or buy something from her. The Hargrove Gala was not her event. She was attending as a major donor, which meant she had paid for the privilege of being asked to pose for photographs all night and listen to speeches about the transformative power of corporate generosity. She believed in the foundation's work. She wrote the check every year without needing to be convinced. What she did not believe in was the performance required of her in exchange for it. She had been standing at those windows for 20 minutes, trying to remember the last time she'd been anywhere that didn't feel like a board meeting with better food, when the noise from the ballroom had shifted. A different quality to it, not the energized hum of a successful event, but something more uncertain, the social ripple of something going wrong. She'd been heading toward the sound to find out what it was when the man appeared in the doorway carrying a child. He was tall. She registered that first, then the ill-fitting jacket, then the child in his arms, and then the child's face, and the sound of the child's breathing, and Vanessa's brain, which was excellent at triage, processed all of it in approximately 1 second. She said, "What do you need?" He didn't stop moving. "Medical kit, kitchen or service area." "This way." She turned without waiting for a response and moved down the hallway at a pace that suggested she expected to be followed. Behind her she heard footsteps, quick, sure, unhesitating. He was keeping up without being told to keep up. They reached the catering corridor in 40 seconds. Vanessa pushed through the service door and the controlled chaos of the kitchen operation stopped. Prep cooks, servers loading trays, a sous chef in mid-sentence. Everything paused in the sudden way that spaces go quiet when something has gone wrong enough to demand attention. She found the kitchen manager instantly. First aid kit, now. Ma'am, I need to... The kit. Where is it? He pointed to a cabinet on the far wall. Vanessa crossed the kitchen and yanked the cabinet open herself. Inside, standard commercial first aid kit. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, rubber gloves, and in the side pocket, a sealed case she pulled out and turned over. Epinephrine auto-injector. Expiration date still valid. She turned with it, and the man was already there. He'd set the girl down on a clear section of prep counter, was checking her airway, her color, the hives across her throat and cheek, moving with a quiet focus that was completely unlike anything she expected from someone in a borrowed suit. He took the injector from Vanessa without looking at her. She watched his hands. They were steady. Completely steady. Not the kind of steady you perform when you're scared, but the kind that comes from repetition, from muscle memory, from having done something so many times that your body knows what to do before your brain catches up. He confirmed the injector type, confirmed the dose, told the little girl to look at his face, kept talking to her in a low, even voice that was somehow both medically focused and entirely about her. About Emma specifically, about the fact that she was going to be fine, and he had her, and she just needed to keep breathing. And then he administered the injection with a precision and confidence that Vanessa had seen in exactly 3 people in her life, and all 3 of them had been holding medical degrees. The girl made a small sound and grabbed his wrist. "I know," he said. "Just breathe. It'll start working." "How long?" Vanessa heard herself ask. He glanced at her for the first time, really looked at her, not just through her the way people usually did when they were managing a crisis. His eyes were dark, steady, slightly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with tonight. "Few minutes. I called 911 when we were in the hallway. They'll want to monitor her." He returned his attention to the girl. "Paramedics are coming, okay? They're just going to check on you. It's routine." "Is it going to stop?" the girl asked. She was 6, maybe 7, with pigtails held in mismatched scrunchies and eyes that were enormous and wet and pinned to his face with the kind of absolute trust that hit Vanessa somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "It's already stopping," he said. "See? You're already breathing better. Can you feel that?" A pause. Yeah. Yeah, that's the medicine. You're doing great." Vanessa stood very still in the middle of her own catering kitchen and watched a man she didn't know talk his daughter through a medical emergency with the precision of someone trained to do it and the tenderness of someone who would have died before letting her down. And she felt, with the clarity of something unavoidable, that she was witnessing something she had no framework for. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. In that time, Mason Reed did not sit down, did not stop talking to Emma, did not look around the kitchen for reassurance or guidance or approval. He did exactly what needed to be done in exactly the order it needed to be done. And the kitchen staff, who had started hovering near the edges of the room with that particular mix of concern and helplessness that civilians get around medical events, gradually relaxed because he was not panicking, and so they didn't need to either. Vanessa had helped. She'd held Emma's hand when Mason needed both of his free to check something. She'd answered questions clearly when the dispatcher called back. She'd gotten Emma a glass of cold water without being asked. She was not used to feeling useful. Not like this. When the paramedics came through the service entrance and Mason walked them through the situation, the allergen, the reaction timeline, the dosage, the current vital signs he'd tracked informally but accurately, one of the paramedics, a woman with a gray ponytail and 20 years on her face, said, "You medical?" Mason paused just a beat too long. "I have some training." The paramedic looked at him the way experienced people look at understatements. "Right," she said, and moved on. Emma was loaded onto the gurney with significantly more drama than the situation strictly required. She had the reaction largely under control, but she was 7 years old and there was a big shiny vehicle outside with flashing lights. So naturally she needed Mason to come with her and hold her hand and answer her increasingly detailed questions about whether ambulances had different kinds of sirens for different kinds of emergencies. Before he followed his gurney out, Mason stopped and turned back. Vanessa was standing in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her chest in a way that she probably thought looked composed, but actually looked like someone holding herself together. He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for the kit, and for... You didn't have to stay." "I know," Vanessa said. Vanessa. He nodded once, seemed to consider something, and then the paramedic called for him, and he was gone down the hallway, and Vanessa heard Emma's voice. "Daddy, do they have a faster siren?" And then the service door closed. The kitchen hummed back into activity around her. Vanessa stood exactly where she was for another 10 seconds. Then she turned to her assistant, Priya, who had materialized silently at her shoulder with the specific competence of someone who had worked for Vanessa Hale for 4 years and knew exactly when to appear. "Find out who he is," Vanessa said. "The man with the child?" "Yes." Priya made a note. "Do you want to know why you want to know?" "No." Priya made another note. "Okay." The hospital let Emma go home after 4 hours. She had recovered with the resilience of the young and the constitutionally dramatic. By the time Mason was signing discharge paperwork, Emma was sitting upright on the exam table eating crackers from a little hospital snack bag and telling the attending nurse the entire plot of her favorite movie in significant detail. The nurse was a good sport about it. Mason sat in the plastic chair beside the exam table and felt the exhaustion come down on him like a physical weight, the particular come down of adrenaline, the way your body, which has been operating at emergency pitch for hours, suddenly remembers that it's tired and hasn't eaten a full meal since this morning. His hands were finally shaking a little now that he could let them. He looked at them for a moment. The slight tremor in his fingers, the dried nick on his jaw, the 2 short cuffs of Doug's jacket, and thought about what the paramedic had said. "You medical?" "I have some training." He'd said that sentence so many times over the past few years that it had started to sound true to him. It was technically accurate. He had training. What he'd chosen to do with it, what he'd walked away from, what he'd buried, was another category entirely. "Daddy," Emma said, mouth full of crackers. "Don't talk with food in your mouth." She swallowed. "Are you sad?" "No." "You look sad." "I'm tired." She studied him with the unflinching assessment of a child who had been paying close attention to her father's face her entire life. "Tired sad or just tired?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Just tired," he said. She went back to her crackers, apparently satisfied. After a moment, she said, "That lady was nice." "Which lady?" "The one in the green dress who held my hand." Mason said nothing. "She had cold hands," Emma said, "but she held my hand anyway for a really long time. And she talked to me. She didn't do the thing adults do where they talk about you to other people like you can't hear them." "That's good. Do you know her name?" "No." Emma finished her cracker and folded the wrapper carefully in half. "I think you should find out," she said, with the casual authority of a 7-year-old who had absolutely no idea how complicated that sentence actually was. Ding. 3 miles away, in the back of a car moving quietly through the late-night streets of a city that never fully went quiet, Vanessa Hale was looking at her phone. She didn't sleep well under the best circumstances, and tonight was not the best circumstances. She'd returned to the gala long enough to have the necessary conversations, sign the necessary checks, accept the photograph requests with the expression she'd spent 15 years perfecting, present enough to satisfy, distant enough to protect. And then she'd excused herself and sat in the back of her car and watched the city go past and thought about a man's hands. Steady hands. She thought about the way he'd spoken to his daughter, not in the oversimplified register that some adults used with children, as if they required everything translated, but directly. Honestly, without pretending that what was happening wasn't happening. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he said thank you, like he was actually seeing her, not Vanessa Hale of Hale Energy, not the billionaire donor founder CEO, but just whoever was standing in that kitchen doorway. She didn't know what to do with that. She was not, historically, a woman who didn't know what to do. She had built a billion-dollar renewable energy company from a research concept in 2 years of 17-hour days. She had negotiated federal contracts and out-negotiated companies 3 times her size. She made decisions quickly and correctly and didn't waste time on ambivalence because ambivalence was expensive. But she had been standing at those windows tonight thinking about how she couldn't remember the last time she'd been somewhere that felt real. And then a man had walked into a doorway carrying his daughter, and something had shifted, and she couldn't put her finger on what had shifted, and it was bothering her. Her phone buzzed. Priya had sent a file. She opened it. The name at the top was Mason Reed, she read. And by the time the car reached her building, she had read the whole thing twice. And the thing that had shifted further, and it wasn't what she'd expected to find. And she was not quite as good at composure as she usually was. She stared at the ceiling of her bedroom for a long time. Not because of the resume, not because of the career, the talent, the unambiguous documentation of a brilliant mind that had walked into oblivion because it loved someone too much. Not because of the grief or the debt or the 4 years of warehouse shifts and handyman jobs that followed a decade of surgical training. She stared at the ceiling because of one photograph in the file, a press clipping from a mountaineering incident 8 years ago. A rescue near the summit of a trail she recognized immediately. She'd been on that trail, she'd been on that mountain, and she'd fallen, and there had been a storm, and she'd been pulled out by a young doctor who happened to be on his first post-residency vacation, and she'd been airlifted out before she could get his name, before she could do anything except barely hold on to consciousness, while someone calm and steady and sure talked her through hypothermia and a broken wrist, and the particular terror of realizing you might not get out. She'd tried to find him, afterward, informally. The way you try to find someone when you're not sure how much you actually want to find them. She hadn't. The face in the press clipping was younger, unlined by what the years had brought, smiling at a friend's camera during a hike. But it was unmistakable. It was his face. Vanessa Hale put her phone down on the nightstand. Outside her window, the city hummed and pulsed and continued being itself, indifferent and enormous. She had been saved twice. By the same person. Years apart. Once in the mountains. Once in a kitchen. She lay in her expensive bed in her empty apartment, and for the first time in a very long time, Vanessa Hale was afraid of something she couldn't control, budget, or schedule. She was afraid of what she was going to do next. Priya Sharma had worked for Vanessa Hale long enough to know when something was off. It wasn't dramatic. Vanessa didn't slam doors or raise her voice or do any of the things that powerful people in movies did when they were rattled. She just went slightly quieter than usual, slightly more precise, responded to emails faster than necessary, as if staying busy enough could crowd out whatever was occupying the background of her mind. Monday morning after the gala, Vanessa arrived at the office 12 minutes before anyone else, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that when Priya brought the morning briefing at 7:45, the coffee on Vanessa's desk was still full and cold, and Vanessa was sitting with her hands flat on the surface of her desk, not looking at the 8 open tabs on her computer screen, not reading the document in front of her, just sitting. Priya set the briefing folder down quietly. "Good morning. Did you finish the file on Mason Reed? I sent it Saturday night. I want more." Priya sat down in the chair across from the desk, which she did only when she needed to ask a clarifying question rather than just execute an instruction. More specifically or more broadly? Vanessa finally looked up. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't usually there. Everything. His medical career, why he left, the specifics of the debt, where he works now, his daughter's medical history if it's accessible. She paused. And there was an incident 8 years ago, a mountain rescue near Ridgeline Pass. I want documentation. Priya wrote it down. Any reason I should know about for the Ridgeline Pass piece? No. Okay. She stood, then stopped. Vanessa, is this a business interest or a personal one? The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which for Vanessa was essentially an eternity. Does it matter? Vanessa said. It matters in terms of how I document the research and whether legal needs to be aware. It's personal, Vanessa said, in the tone of someone pulling a splinter out, brief, controlled, slightly pained. Keep it off the formal record. Priya nodded and left without pushing it further, because 4 years had taught her exactly where the line was. Vanessa returned to looking at her hands on her desk. She had not slept particularly well. She'd lain in her enormous bed in the enormous apartment that she'd bought because the realtor told her the square footage was an investment, and she'd stared at the ceiling and replayed things she should have been too rational to dwell on. The sound of a child struggling to breathe, the steadiness of a man's hands, a press clipping with a face she recognized across 8 years and a mountain. She was not a person who dwelled. She was not a person who circled back over things she couldn't change or control. She was a person who identified the available options, evaluated them by probability of success and cost-benefit analysis, selected the best one, and executed. That process had made her very wealthy and very effective, and as a side effect, she'd mostly stopped examining, very alone. She opened the file Priya had sent. She read it again. All of it. Mason Allen Reed. Born 32 years ago in a mid-sized city in Ohio to parents who were both teachers. Graduated top of his class in high school. Full academic scholarship. Medical school at 23, surgical residency at 27, pediatric surgery fellowship completed at 30. His evaluations from the fellowship were the kind of thing that got framed and hung in hospital corridors. Not just technically gifted, but instinctively good with children, with the specific ability to stay calm in situations that broke other residents. One attending had written in a formal evaluation, "Rarely encounter someone who was made for this. Reed was made for this." Then the narrative broke. His wife's name was Sarah. She'd been 31 when the diagnosis came, a rare and aggressive form of cancer that hit fast and moved faster. There had been treatment for a while. There had been hope for a while, the fragile kind that you build carefully and try not to look at too directly in case it collapses under the weight of your attention. There had been a little girl, Emma, born 2 years before the diagnosis, which meant Emma had been 3 when the world started falling apart and 5 when it finished the job. Mason Reed had taken a leave of absence from his fellowship program 6 months after the diagnosis, citing family circumstances. The program director's note in the administrative file said, "Reed requested indefinite leave. We hold the position, but I don't expect him to come back. He was the best we had, and he's going to disappear into this, and we won't be able to stop him." Slightly unprofessional for an official document. The kind of thing you wrote when you were genuinely mourning something. The leave became permanent 14 months later. After that, the professional record simply stopped. What replaced it was a different kind of documentation. Tax records, lease agreements, employment stubs from a logistics warehouse, an LLC filing for a handyman service that appeared to serve primarily elderly and low-income clients in the western part of the city. He charged, Priya had noted in a dry addendum to the file, significantly below market rate. Several of his recurring clients appeared to be people who couldn't have afforded anyone else. Vanessa had read that detail 3 times over the weekend. She read it again now. The debt was substantial. Medical bills, the kind that accumulate when you're fighting something unfightable, and you keep trying anyway because the alternative is giving up, and you are constitutionally incapable of giving up. Exactly the kind of debt that follows people for decades, that rearranges the entire geometry of a life, that turns a man who was supposed to be saving children's lives in a hospital into a man checking pallets in a warehouse at 2 a.m. She closed the file. Outside her office window, the city was doing its ordinary morning thing, taxis and pedestrians and the distant sound of construction. Entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere on the west side of it, a man who had saved her life twice was working jobs designed for people without options. She picked up her phone and called someone she hadn't called in 3 years. Dr. James Whitfield picked up on the second ring, which probably meant he was still in his office before rounds. He and Vanessa had met at a hospital fundraiser 6 years ago and maintained the specific kind of friendship that exists between 2 people who respect each other and occasionally have useful information for each other and never have time for anything more than that. "Vanessa," he said, "what time is it?" 7:50. "Is something wrong with you medically?" "No." "Then why are you calling me before 8 a.m? "I need information about a former surgical fellow, pediatric. He trained at Northern Metro about 3 years ago and took leave before completing." A pause. "That's an unusual ask." "I know. You understand I can't share private medical personnel information. I'm not asking about his personnel file. I'm asking about him generally, his reputation, his work." She kept her voice even. "Professionally." Another pause, the sound of Whitfield moving, possibly closing his office door. "Mason Reed?" Vanessa went still. "You know him." "I know of him. His fellowship director was Elaine Harlan. She still talked about him. Present tense, not past, which is unusual given how long ago it was." He paused. "His wife died. The daughter had some health complications of her own. He didn't come back." "What would it take to bring someone like him back, to medicine?" "That's a complicated question. I'm good at complicated questions." "You're good at problems that money solves," Whitfield said, not unkindly. I'm not sure this is that category. The men and women who step away from medicine after that kind of loss, the career's not usually the main obstacle. The main obstacle is that they stopped believing it was theirs to go back to, like they gave up the right to it when they chose something else. He paused. Why are you interested in Reed specifically? He saved my daughter's life, Vanessa said, which was technically true in a deflected sort of way, and also the only version of the truth she was prepared to give Whitfield at 7:50 on a Monday morning. He doesn't have a daughter. He has a patient who is currently 7 years old, recovering from an anaphylactic reaction, and eating cereal at a kitchen table on the west side of the city because he responded correctly and quickly on Saturday night. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Ah, the Hargrove Gala. I heard there was an incident. He handled it. Of course he did. Something in Whitfield's voice shifted. Not quite warmth, but close to it, the tone of a person acknowledging something long suspected. What are you actually planning, Vanessa? I don't know yet, she said. That's a first. Don't make it a thing. It's already a thing, Whitfield said. Call Elaine Harlan at Northern Metro. If you want to understand what Mason Reed was and what he could be, she's the one to talk to. He hung up before she could respond. Vanessa set her phone down and looked out the window for a long moment. Then she pulled the briefing folder toward her and picked up a pen. She still didn't know exactly what she was planning, but she was excellent at doing the work first and understanding her reasons later. And in the complete privacy of her own head, she was beginning to admit that the feeling she'd woken up with for 3 consecutive mornings was not something she could file under professional interest and let it go at that. She found him on a Wednesday. Not because Priya had tracked him down. She had, but Vanessa hadn't wanted to show up somewhere he'd been sent on purpose by someone who'd been specifically looking for him. She found him the other way, by putting herself in the same neighborhood at the same time and letting the city do its work. The west side of the city at noon on a Wednesday was a specific kind of place, the kind that didn't show up in magazine profiles or development pitches, corner stores and laundromats, a park where old men played chess regardless of the weather, a row of apartment buildings that had been built in the 1970s and maintained only to the degree necessary to avoid formal code violations. Vanessa Hale, who owned a penthouse apartment in one of the most expensive zip codes in the city, had no reason to be standing on this sidewalk. She was wearing a coat that cost more than some of the cars parked nearby. She was accompanied only by the fact of herself. No driver, no Priya, no buffer, which was something she did so rarely that the solitude felt strange in her body, like remembering how to walk after an injury. She walked for 20 minutes before she found him. He was fixing a porch railing on a narrow row house 3 blocks from Emma's school. She'd known the address from Priya's file, not his address, but the job he'd had scheduled that morning, a handyman call for a woman named Mrs. Okafor, who was 73 and lived alone, and had apparently been calling Mason for small repairs for almost 2 years. The railing on her front porch had been loose since August, and she'd been waiting until she could afford to have it fixed, which meant waiting until Mason's schedule had a gap, when she could pay him the discounted rate they'd apparently negotiated without either of them formally acknowledging it was discounted. He was kneeling at the base of the railing post with a cordless drill, wearing jeans and a gray work jacket, completely focused on what he was doing. There was a small toolbox open on the porch step beside him. He'd also apparently brought lunch. A brown paper bag sat on the top porch step, and Mrs. Okafor was seated in a plastic chair just inside the open front door, talking at him while he worked. Told Raymond the same thing. I said that boy better come home before Christmas or I'm giving his room to the neighbor's dog. And I mean it. You've been threatening to give his room to the dog for 6 months, Mason said without looking up from the railing post. I'm very serious this time. You're always very serious. Don't you take that tone. What tone? That's my normal voice. Your normal voice sounds like a man who thinks he's smarter than me. He looked up at her then, and the expression on his face was something Vanessa hadn't expected. Genuine warmth, the unguarded kind. The kind that only exists between people who have been honest with each other long enough that performances stopped being worth the effort. Mrs. O, you are smarter than me. I'm fixing your porch for $11 less than the last guy charged you. That's not smarter, that's cheaper. Close enough. Mrs. Okafor laughed, and then she looked past him toward the sidewalk where Vanessa was standing and her expression shifted to the friendly assessment of a woman who has been watching a neighborhood long enough to know when something is out of place. "Can I help you, honey?" Mason turned. He went very still for a moment, not surprised. She had the sense he'd been somewhat expecting something, even if not this specifically, not here. He registered her presence the way a person does when they've been thinking about something, and then the thing appears, with a brief flash of recognition that he controlled before it could become expression. He stood up slowly. "Ms. Hale," he said. She walked up the front path, keeping her hands in her coat pockets because she didn't know what else to do with them. "I wanted to check on Emma," she said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, and she suspected he knew that. "She's fine," he said, fully recovered. "Back at school Monday." "I'm glad." A silence sat between them for a moment. Mrs. Okafor was watching this exchange with great interest and absolutely no pretense of doing otherwise. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Research." "You researched me?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, not angry, evaluating, the same quality of attention she'd noticed in the kitchen, the way he looked at things he needed to understand before he could figure out what to do about them. Why? It was a fair question, and she'd spent 4 days preparing an answer for it and had 7 different versions depending on context, and standing in front of him on a cracked concrete path with Mrs. Okafor watching from the doorway, all 7 of them evaporated, and what came out was the honest thing. "I don't entirely know." He considered that, picked up his drill. "I've got another 40 minutes here." "I can wait?" "The diner on Clement Street is 2 blocks. Better coffee than it looks." "Okay." She walked to the diner. She sat at a corner table and ordered coffee she didn't really need, and she looked out the window at the gray Wednesday afternoon, and she tried to remember the last time she'd waited for something without being certain she knew what it was going to give her. She couldn't. He arrived 37 minutes later, work jacket traded for the zip-up underneath, hands clean from the tap outside the diner, toolbox apparently left in the truck. He sat down across from her without ceremony and ordered a black coffee from the waitress by name, which told Vanessa he was here regularly enough that the waitress knew him. They sat with their coffees for a moment. "She feeds me lunch every time," he said. "Mrs. Okafor, every job I do there's food. Doesn't matter if it's a 20-minute call or a half-day project. When I come out, there's food." She seems like that kind of person. She lost her husband 2 years ago. Her son's in another state. She spends a lot of time alone. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "I think the jobs are partly about the company." Vanessa looked at him. "You charge her below rate." Something shifted in his expression. Brief, controlled. "You did a lot of research." "I did." "How much?" "Enough to know you went to school on a full scholarship, completed one of the most competitive pediatric fellowships in the state, and are currently fixing porch railings on the west side for $60 an hour." He said nothing. "I'm not judging it," she said. "I want that to be clear. I'm just telling you what I found." "What else did you find?" She held his gaze. "That you left because your wife was sick and you weren't going to let her go through that alone. That the debt from treatment took everything. That you've been keeping Emma alive and fed and loved for 4 years on jobs that have nothing to do with what you trained to do." So, she paused. "And that 8 years ago on Ridgeline Pass, a young doctor on his vacation pulled a woman with a broken wrist and early-stage hypothermia off the mountain during a storm and disappeared before she could thank him." The silence that followed had a different quality to it. Heavier, more complicated. Mason set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with the specific expression of a person recalculating something. "That was you," he said. Not a question. "That was me." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't recognize you at the gala." "You were a little busy." A beat, and then, unexpectedly, something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite complete itself. "Yeah," he said. "I was. I tried to find you. After the mountain. I didn't try hard enough." He looked at her. "You didn't need to." "I know I didn't need to. I wanted to." She watched him process that. "I wanted to say thank you, and I never got to. And then last Saturday, you walked through that doorway carrying Emma and I." She stopped, found the word she was looking for. I recognized you, not immediately, but something. He didn't fill the silence the way most people did when she let things sit, didn't rush to reassure her or explain it away or redirect. He just sat with it, which was something she found unexpectedly disarming. "How's the wrist?" he said finally. She blinked. "What?" "Your wrist. You had a distal radius fracture, left side." "It healed fine." She paused. "I still notice it in cold weather." He nodded once. "You were in mild hypothermia when I found you. You didn't want to stop moving. You kept trying to walk. You thought if you kept moving, you'd stay warm." "I remember. That's actually exactly backwards. Moving accelerates heat loss. I know that now. You were very stubborn about it." "I'm very stubborn about most things." He looked at her for a moment. "I remember," he said quietly. The diner hummed around them. The waitress refilled Mason's coffee without asking. Outside, the Wednesday afternoon continued to be gray and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the two people sitting at a corner table, figuring out what they were to each other across 8 years and 2 different mountains. "I'm not here to offer you something," Vanessa said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to fix something or write a check or I'm just here because I couldn't not come." He looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said. "Okay as in you believe me, or okay as in you're deciding whether to believe me?" "Okay as in both," he said. "I've had people try to offer things before, after Sarah. People who meant well and led with money because that's what they had, and they didn't know what else to give. It's uncomfortable being a project." "I imagine so." "So if this turns into that, I'll tell you," she said, "before it does. I'm not good at a lot of things, but I'm direct. Your reputation suggests that's accurate." "You looked me up." "After the gala, yes." "What did you find?" He picked up his coffee. "That you built something genuinely significant from scratch. That you're harder on your employees than you need to be. That you give a lot of money to the Hargrove Foundation and 3 other medical charities and don't put your name on any of it." He met her eyes. "I had to dig for that last part." She felt something pull at her, an unfamiliar sensation, the particular vulnerability of being seen by someone who wasn't looking for leverage. "The anonymous donations are separate from the ones that serve a PR function," she said. "I figured. The ones with my name are the ones where the public association helps bring in other donors. The ones without—" She paused. "Those are just because the work matters." He nodded. Quiet again, but not uncomfortable quiet. The kind that meant something was being processed rather than avoided. "Emma talked about you," he said after a moment. Vanessa looked up. "On the drive home from the hospital, she said you had cold hands, but you held hers anyway." He looked at his coffee cup. "She doesn't say things like that about people she's just met. She's careful about who she— I've made her careful, maybe too careful." He paused. "She asked if I knew your name." "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't." "You do now." "I do now," he agreed. Vanessa wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The warmth of it was something ordinary and specific and real, and she focused on that for a moment. The solidity of the ceramic, the heat of the liquid, because she was doing that thing she rarely did, stepping somewhere uncertain without being able to calculate the distance to the other side. "I'd like to see her again," she said. "Emma, if you're comfortable with that." She looked at him steadily. "I don't have a complicated reason for it. She's a remarkable kid, and she went through something frightening, and I found myself thinking about her." Mason looked at her for a long time. She could see him doing the work, not performing suspicion, not performing openness, just actually thinking it through, weighing it, being honest with himself about what he felt about it. "Saturday," he said finally. "We go to the farmer's market on Clement Saturday mornings. Emma's obsessed with the honey stand. She spends most of her allowance on little jars of honey and then barely uses them." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "She has 11 jars in the pantry. I'm not entirely sure why she keeps buying them. Maybe she just likes having them. Maybe." He looked at her. "You could come, if you want to see how normal people spend a Saturday morning." "I don't know how normal people spend a Saturday morning," Vanessa said honestly. "No," he said. "I didn't think you did." No. She went to the farmer's market. She wore jeans, which felt like a deliberate choice. and a coat that was still nicer than most things there, but passably anonymous. And she arrived 7 minutes after they'd agreed because she'd sat in her car for 6 minutes trying to understand why she was nervous, and concluded she wasn't nervous in the way she recognized. She was nervous in the way that meant something was real. Emma saw her first. She was standing at the honey stand, holding a small jar up to the light, with the intense focus of a scientist examining a specimen, and she turned and spotted Vanessa, and her face did something that Vanessa was not prepared for. She smiled. Not the polite smile of a child who'd been coached to be friendly toward adults, just immediate, uncalculated delight. The smile of someone who is genuinely happy to see you. "You came," Emma said. "I said I would. Adults say things sometimes and then don't." "I know, I came anyway." Emma looked at her for a moment with those large, assessing eyes, and then held out the jar. "What do you think? Clover or wildflower?" Vanessa looked at the two small jars in Emma's hands. "What's the difference?" "Clover is sweeter. Wildflower is more complicated. It tastes like more than one thing." "Wildflower," Vanessa said. Emma considered this with great seriousness. "That's what I thought too." She turned back to the stand. Mason appeared at Vanessa's shoulder with 2 cups of coffee from a cart near the entrance. He held one out to her. "She's been here 20 minutes already," he said. "She has a whole system." "I can see that." "She ranks them every week. Last week Clover was first, week before Lavender. It changes." They stood side by side, watching Emma conduct her honey assessment with the focused efficiency of someone who took her work seriously. The market was busy. Families, older couples, a group of college students loudly debating the price of tomatoes. Ordinary Saturday morning sounds and smells, coffee and bread, and the specific green smell of cut flowers from the florist booth. Vanessa hadn't been to a farmer's market in years. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been somewhere with no agenda, nowhere to be, nothing to evaluate except whether the clover honey was better than the wildflower. "She's extraordinary," Vanessa said quietly. Mason said nothing for a moment. "She's a lot like her mom," he said finally, and the sentence carried the specific weight of things said simply because the complicated versions would take too long. Vanessa didn't offer condolences or fill it with reassurance. She just nodded. They drank their coffee and watched Emma negotiate the purchase of a wildflower honey jar with a seriousness that suggested she was finalizing a merger. And the morning went on around them, ordinary and unhurried, and at no point did Vanessa think about her inbox or her board or the quarterly projections. And that was, she realized, genuinely unusual. Emma looked back at them over her shoulder. "Are you two going to just stand there the whole time?" she called. "Yes," Mason said. "That's boring." She waved them forward. "Come on, there's a bread person, and they have the good kind with the seeds on top." Mason glanced at Vanessa. Something in his expression had shifted slightly. Relaxed, maybe, or just less guarded than it had been at the diner. Not fully open, but the door was no longer completely closed. "Come on," he said. "She won't let up until you've tried the bread." "Is it good?" "It's very good," he said. "That's the problem. Once you know about it, you can't go back to regular bread." "That sounds like a metaphor." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was this time definitely the beginning of a smile. "It's bread," he said. "Don't read into everything." Vanessa followed them down the market aisle, and Emma grabbed her hand without asking as they wove through the crowd and the familiarity of it. The casual, unconsidered trust of a child who had decided you were safe moved through Vanessa like something she didn't have a word for and didn't try to name. She just held the small hand and walked forward. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. 2 blocks away and 2 weeks later, in a corner office at Northern Metro Hospital, Dr. Elaine Harlan set down the phone after a 10-minute conversation with Vanessa Hale and sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened her desk drawer, pulled out the file she kept there, the one with the fellowship evaluations, the ones she'd never thrown away, and placed it on her desk. Rarely encounter someone who was made for this. Reed was made for this. She'd written that line 3 years ago and believed every word of it, and then watched it walk out the door and told herself there was nothing she could do. Maybe there was something she could do now. She picked up her own phone and dialed a number she'd been sitting on for a long time. It rang twice. A man answered, tired sounding, slightly cautious. The voice of someone who'd learned to be careful about unexpected calls. "Dr. Reed," she said. "This is Elaine Harlan. I know it's been a while." She paused. "I think it's time we talked." The phone call from Elaine Harlan lasted 43 minutes. Mason knew this because he'd checked the time when he answered, habit from years of tracking every hour against what it cost or produced. And he checked it again when he finally set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there with his hand still on it, not quite ready to let go of the object that had just delivered something he hadn't known how to ask for and wasn't sure he deserved. Emma was asleep. It was 9:30 on a Tuesday night, and the apartment was quiet in the specific way it got after she went to bed. The ambient hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor's television through the wall, the creak of the building doing its old building things. Mason had been washing dishes when the call came in, and the sink was still running, and he reached over now and turned it off. He stood in the silence. Elaine Harlan had not opened with pleasantries, which he'd appreciated. She'd opened with, "I should have called sooner. I want you to know I'm aware of that." And then she'd waited, in the way of someone who had earned the right to wait by acknowledging the thing first. He'd said, "Why didn't you?" She'd been quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't know what to say. And because I thought you needed time. And if I'm honest, because the program lost something when you left, and it was easier not to look directly at that." It was the most honest thing a former supervisor had ever said to him, and it had the disorienting effect of making him slightly more angry and significantly more disarmed at the same time. They had talked about Sarah, not in detail, not with the clinical distance that people sometimes deployed around grief to make it manageable from a polite conversation, but in the plain, factual way of two people who understood that some things just happened, and the only honest response was to acknowledge the weight of them. Elaine had known, professionally. She'd processed the leave request. But she'd never asked after, and Mason had never offered. And so the understanding between them had existed entirely in the space of what hadn't been said. She'd talked about the fellowship position, not his old slot, that was filled, obviously, 3 times over in 3 years, but a part-time consulting arrangement that Northern Metro had recently created specifically to address a staffing gap in their pediatric outpatient program. 2 days a week. Manageable hours. A reintegration pathway that didn't require him to immediately step back into the full weight of surgical practice. "It's not what you were," she'd said. "It's a starting point, if you want one." "Why now?" he'd asked. "Because someone reminded me that I had something worth doing, and I was choosing not to do it." He'd known, without asking, who that someone was. He stood in his kitchen for a long time after the call. The dish soap was still on the edge of the sink. Emma's drawings were still on the refrigerator, a new one she'd added yesterday. A picture that was unmistakably of 3 people, 2 tall and 1 small, standing somewhere with something yellow all around them that might have been the farmer's market, or might have been something Emma had constructed purely in the geography of her imagination. He looked at the drawing for a long time. The 3 people had been drawn with the specific artistic priorities of a 7-year-old. Faces large and expressive, bodies secondary, detail given to the things Emma considered important. The small figure, herself clearly, with pigtails indicated by 2 spiky lines, was positioned in the middle. The taller figures flanked her on each side. One had a square jaw Mason recognized as his own artistic representation. The other had dark hair and what appeared to be a coat. He pulled the drawing off the refrigerator and looked at it more closely. Emma had given the tall figure on the right a small detail that he hadn't noticed at first glance. She'd drawn a pair of hands and colored them blue, and connected one of those blue hands to Emma's own small drawn hand. Cold hands, Mason thought. Emma had told him the woman had cold hands. She'd remembered it specifically enough to put it in the drawing. He stuck the drawing back on the refrigerator. He was going to call Elaine Harlan back in the morning and say yes. He knew that already, had known it somewhere before he'd even hung up, in the deep back part of himself that had been quietly gathering the courage for this specific thing for longer than he'd admitted. But he stood in the kitchen a while longer anyway, because some things deserved the respect of standing still with them before you moved. He told Vanessa about the call on Thursday. They'd developed over the 5 weeks since the farmer's market, something that didn't have an official name yet, a series of overlapping presences in each other's lives that had accumulated gradually enough that Mason couldn't have pointed to the moment it became a pattern. She'd come to the market again the second Saturday. Then Emma had asked, with the directness unique to children, whether Vanessa wanted to come for dinner sometime, and Mason had been standing right there, and couldn't reasonably contradict it, and so Vanessa had come for dinner the following Tuesday. She'd arrived with a bottle of wine and a small jar of wildflower honey for Emma, which Emma had received with the solemnity of someone being presented a significant gift, and the evening had been the particular combination of slightly awkward and genuinely warm that happens when people are still figuring each other out, but are honest enough about it that the awkwardness doesn't calcify into distance. Vanessa had sat at Mason's kitchen table and eaten homemade soup and been talked at by Emma for 45 uninterrupted minutes about a documentary Emma had watched about deep-sea creatures, specifically anglerfish, which Emma found both horrifying and compelling for reasons she was working through in real time. Vanessa had listened with what appeared to be genuine engagement, not the performed attention of an adult pretending to care about a child's interests, but actual curiosity, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd been tracking the information rather than waiting for Emma to finish. Mason had watched this from the stove and felt something settle slightly inside himself, a small adjustment to the set of his shoulders that he hadn't noticed he'd been carrying until it shifted. After Emma was in bed, they'd sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of the bottle and talked in the low, careful way that people talk when they're being honest about things they don't usually say out loud. Vanessa had told him about the company, not the public version, the one that appeared in profiles and press releases, but the actual version, the 15 years of decisions made on not enough sleep and often not enough information, the specific cost of building something significant when you were a woman in a field that treated women as anomalies. The loneliness of it. The way success could be so consuming that you looked up one day and realized you'd lost the habit of connecting with people and weren't entirely sure where you'd put it. "Do you regret it?" he'd asked. She'd thought about it. "I regret specific things. I don't regret building it. I just thought..." She stopped, started again. "I think I believed that the company would be enough, that having built something real would feel like enough." A pause. "It doesn't." "No," Mason said. "It doesn't." She'd looked at him. "What does?" He looked at Emma's latest drawing on the refrigerator. She rotated them, newer ones going up as older ones came down, though she kept all of them in a folder in her room. "This," he said, "this is the only thing that's ever felt like enough." So they had been building something, the three of them, without formally agreeing to build it, in the way that certain things construct themselves out of repeated small choices rather than single large declarations. Vanessa came for dinner on Tuesdays. She and Emma had started a thing where Emma told her one new fact she'd learned that week, and Vanessa had to respond with a related fact she knew. And they kept a running tally of whose facts were more interesting. Emma was winning by a significant margin, largely because Emma had an unfair competitive advantage in the form of a recent obsession with marine biology. On Thursdays, Mason and Vanessa occasionally met for coffee alone. No Emma, which gave those conversations a different quality, more direct, more complicated. Thursday was when he told her about Harlan's call. "She offered me a part-time position," he said. "Consulting, outpatient pediatrics, 2 days a week." Vanessa had both hands around her coffee cup and was watching him with the particular quality of attention she gave things that mattered. Still and focused. "Are you going to take it?" "I already called her back." A pause. "And?" "I said yes." He looked at his coffee. "I said yes on Wednesday morning. I was going to tell you sooner, but I needed to, I don't know, sit with it." "How does it feel?" He considered the question, which was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer rather than a reflexive one. "Terrifying," he said, "like putting weight on a leg you're not sure is healed." He paused. "And also like the first day back at the gym after a long time, where every part of you is protesting, but underneath the protest there's something that recognizes it. Muscle memory," she said. "Something like that?" She was quiet for a moment. "Is this... Did you say yes because you wanted to, or because someone made it happen and you felt like you should?" It was the right question, the direct question, the one that came from someone who had paid enough attention to know what the real risk was. He looked at her. "Both, partly, but mostly because I wanted to." He paused. "I've been wanting to for a while. I just couldn't find the door." "I didn't open the door," she said, quietly, but clearly. I want to be specific about that. Harlan had your number. She could have called any time. She had your push. She had a reason to act on something she already wanted to do. Vanessa met his eyes. Don't give me credit for your decision. It's yours. He held her gaze. There was something in this that he was still learning. The particular challenge of accepting help from someone without converting it into a debt, without letting it shift the balance of the thing between them into something transactional. He had a long history of refusing help rather than navigating that, which was its own kind of damage. Sarah had called it his martyrdom complex, which had irritated him when she said it and struck him as entirely accurate in retrospect. Okay, he said. It's mine. Good. She sipped her coffee. Are you scared? Yeah. Of medicine or of something else? He looked at her. Both, he said, and left it there. He started at Northern Metro on a Monday in November, which was an unremarkable day in most measurable ways. Gray sky, cold enough for the heavy jacket, Emma's alarm going off at 6:30 and requiring 3 separate wake-up attempts before she produced any meaningful signs of life. Mason dropped Emma at school at 7:50, which left him 40 minutes before he needed to be at the hospital. He sat in his truck in the school parking lot for a while, which he recognized was avoidance behavior, and did it anyway. The truck was not a nice truck. It was 11 years old and had 140,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that had been on so long, Mason had started to think of it as a permanent feature rather than a warning. The heater worked on the right side of the cab, but only intermittently on the left. There was a crack in the windshield on the passenger side that he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months and kept not getting to. He sat in the imperfect truck in the gray November morning and thought about Sarah. He did this less than he used to. In the first year, it had been constant, less thought and more presence, the way certain losses occupy your body before they settle into memory. She had been everywhere in the first year, in the way Emma laughed, in the empty side of the bed, in the specific silence of a house where someone used to make noise and doesn't anymore. It had gotten quieter as time went on, which he'd been told was normal and had experienced as both relief and something close to guilt. But he still talked to her sometimes, in the private way of someone who wasn't sure they believed it did anything but did it anyway because the alternative was not doing it. I'm going back, he thought, at the particular quality of silence that he'd learned to aim at her. I know you'd tell me to stop being dramatic about it. I know you'd say it's about time. The crack in the windshield caught the gray morning light. He started the truck and drove to Northern Metro. The hospital smelled exactly the same. That was the thing about hospitals. They had a specific olfactory signature that was partly antiseptic and partly recycled air and partly something harder to name, something that had to do with the proximity of critical things, and it printed itself on your nervous system during training and never fully left. Mason walked through the main entrance and his body knew where it was before his mind had fully confirmed it, already orienting, already moving with a slightly different quality of attention. Elaine Harlan met him in the lobby. She was smaller than he remembered, or he was remembering her wrong. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and the kind of energy that suggested she'd been running at this pace for 30 years and had no plans to slow down. She shook his hand with the directness of someone who didn't perform warmth but had genuine reserves of it. You look good, she said. I look tired, he said. You look like you did 3 years ago. Tired was your baseline. She turned and started walking, clearly expecting him to follow. I'm going to show you the outpatient setup. It's nothing like what you were doing before. We're talking consult-level work, evaluations, follow-ups. You won't be in the OR. I know. Does that bother you? Ask me in a month. She glanced at him as they walked. Fair. They turned down a corridor that Mason recognized from the layout of the building past a nurse's station where 2 people looked up and went back to their work. The team knows you're coming on as a consulting fellow. Nobody knows your full history unless you've told them. I haven't told anyone. Then nobody knows. Fresh context. She pushed through a set of double doors into the outpatient wing. The work is straightforward. Developmental assessments, chronic condition management, some post-surgical follow-up for kids who've been discharged from inpatient. You'll shadow for the first 2 weeks, then run your own patient list with oversight. Mason looked at the ward as they walked through it. The rooms were smaller than inpatient, the energy more dispersed. Parents in chairs beside examination tables, Kids in various stages of the particular tension that hospitals produce in them, that mix of boredom and anxiety and the performance of being fine when things are not entirely fine. He noticed a small girl, maybe 5, sitting on an exam table in a room with the door partly open, drawing something in a notebook while her mother talked to a nurse. Something shifted in his chest. Not grief, not nostalgia, something more immediate than that. Something that recognized a thing it knew. "Okay," he said. Elaine glanced at him. Okay, as in, let's start," he said. "Show me the charts." She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who'd been waiting 3 years for this sentence. "Come on," she said, and kept walking. The first weeks were harder than he'd expected and better than he'd feared, which was roughly how most worthwhile things went. The medical knowledge was still there. It didn't leave that kind of training. What required adjustment was the surrounding context, the administrative systems that had changed, the protocols that had been updated, the electronic records platform that was different from what he'd used before and required 3 sessions with a very patient IT specialist named Carlos, who did not make Mason feel bad about being slow with it, which Mason appreciated. There were moments when he felt the gap between what he'd been and what he was now. The particular professional awkwardness of relearning a fluency you'd had and lost. And those moments were uncomfortable in the specific way of things that were necessary rather than optional. But then there were the kids. There was a 9-year-old named Marcus who had been through 2 cardiac surgeries and came to his follow-up appointment with the energy of someone who had decided being alive was an excellent situation and intended to make the most of it loudly. He talked Mason's ear off about a video game for 15 minutes before the exam began, and Mason let him, because Marcus had been told he was complicated and fragile for most of his life, and sometimes what a kid needed most was to be treated like a person before being treated like a patient. There was a 6-year-old named Lily who wouldn't speak in the appointment, wouldn't speak to anyone in clinical settings, it turned out, a response to something difficult in her history. But who, when Mason sat on the floor of the exam room, rather than looming over her from standing height, pulled out a small stuffed rabbit and introduced it to him with the careful formality of someone performing a significant social act. He examined the rabbit first, with the stethoscope and the reflex hammer and all of it, grave and thorough, before he touched Lily. By the end of the appointment, Lily had climbed into his lap to look at something he was showing her on the tablet, and her mother had been crying quietly in the corner chair for 10 minutes and trying not to let anyone see. He saw Elaine in the hallway after that one. "The Ramos girl," Elaine said. "Yeah. She hasn't let anyone examine her without a full meltdown in 2 years." Mason looked at the closed exam room door. "She just needed someone to take the rabbit seriously." Elaine looked at him for a moment. "That's what it takes. With the right ones." She paused. "Welcome back, Dr. Reed." He didn't respond to the title. It still felt strange on him, like wearing something that used to fit perfectly and now required readjustment. But he didn't correct her either. He went and wrote up his notes. Emma found out about the hospital on a Sunday, not because Mason made an announcement, but because Emma found his Northern Metro badge on the kitchen counter while she was looking for a rubber band. She picked it up and looked at it for a long time. "Daddy," she said. He was in the other room. "Yeah. This says Dr. Reed." A pause. "Yeah." She appeared in the doorway holding the badge in both hands with a seriousness that reminded him so acutely of Sarah that it briefly stopped his breath. "You're a doctor again?" "Part of the way," he said carefully. "I'm doing some consulting work at a hospital. It's not like before." "But you're helping kids." "Some of them." She looked at the badge for another moment. "Mom always said you were supposed to be a doctor," she said. "She told me. When I was little. She said you were the best kind." He did not trust himself to speak for several seconds. Emma walked over and handed the badge back to him. "You should put it somewhere you won't lose it," she said, with the practical authority of someone who had given this sufficient thought. "Not on the counter." "Where should I put it?" She considered. "By the door, so you remember to take it." He looked at her. This small, certain, extraordinarily particular person who had his face and her mother's eyes and had managed somehow, in the absence of so many things, to develop into someone who handed you exactly what you needed to hear in the form of a 7-year-old's logistical advice. By the door, he said. By the door, she confirmed, and went back to looking for the rubber band. The three of them had been building something, and then November arrived, and the thing they'd been building ran into a wall. It started at Emma's routine cardiology follow-up. She'd had a murmur noted at her 3-year checkup, a small, incidental finding, one of those things that got flagged and monitored and had been described as low concern at every subsequent appointment. Mason had filed it in the category of things that required vigilance rather than alarm, which was a different part of the brain from the part that carried active fear. But the category existed, had always existed, and he visited it regularly at 2 in the morning without acknowledging that he was doing it. The cardiologist's name was Dr. Soren Bay, and he was excellent at his job and had the specific quality of honesty that Mason recognized and respected, and on this particular afternoon in November, did not want to receive. Bay had looked at the echocardiogram for a long time. The murmur has changed, he said. Mason was sitting in the chair beside Emma's exam table. Emma was watching something on a tablet with earbuds in. Mason had brought it specifically so she could tune out for the appointment because she was old enough to understand medical conversations if she was paying attention, and some conversations needed to happen in a different register first. How? Mason said. The valve is showing early abnormality. Not emergency level yet, but trending in a direction I don't want to ignore. Bay set down the chart and looked at Mason directly. I want to refer her to pediatric cardiac surgery for evaluation. The likely recommendation is going to be repair, sooner rather than later, while the cardiac function is still strong. The room was very quiet, except for the faint tinny sound of whatever Emma was watching. Timeline, Mason said. 6 to 8 weeks for the evaluation. If they recommend surgery, probably 3 to 4 months after that, depending on scheduling and her overall presentation. Mason looked at Emma. She was watching the tablet with her feet swinging off the edge of the exam table, completely unaware of what was happening 18 inches to her left. She had a small smile at whatever she was watching. One of her cartoon cat scrunchies had slipped and was hanging at a precarious angle from the end of one pigtail. He reached over and straightened it without thinking. Emma didn't look up. Okay, Mason said. Who do you recommend for the surgical evaluation? Ba gave him the name. Mason knew it, knew the reputation, knew the program, knew it was the right call. He asked the relevant questions in the calm, functional register that he'd spent his whole career developing and that served him now with the specific cruelty of professionalism, keeping the fear at professional distance while the evaluation happened. When they were done, he closed Emma's tablet and said, Hey, Bug, Dr. Bay found something we're going to keep an eye on. Emma took out her earbuds. She looked at Bay, then at Mason. Is it my heart? Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Is it bad? It's something that needs to be fixed. It's fixable. He held her gaze. I promise you it's fixable. She looked at him with the specific quality of trust that 7-year-olds place in parents, comprehensive and slightly terrifying in its completeness. Okay, she said, and put her earbuds back in. Mason looked at the wall. He let himself have 30 seconds of pure, unfiltered fear, which was all he could afford. Then he put it somewhere he could carry it and drove his daughter home. He told Vanessa that same evening, not because he'd planned to. He'd driven home, made dinner, put Emma to bed with an extra story, and sat at the kitchen table in the specific quiet of a house where something had shifted. He picked up his phone twice and put it down. The third time, he called. She answered on the second ring. Hey, Emma's cardiologist found something today, he said. She's going to need heart surgery. A silence. Not the silence of someone shocked into stillness, but the silence of someone absorbing a thing and taking it seriously. How serious? Serious enough. Not emergency. But not nothing. What are the options? There's one option, surgery. The question is when and who performs it, and He stopped. How you pay for it, she said quietly. He was quiet. Mason. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I know you're not. He pressed his hand flat on the kitchen table. I'm telling you because I needed to tell someone. Because I've been sitting here for 3 hours, and the only person I wanted to call was you. He paused. That's not a request, it's just true. The silence on the line had a different quality now. I'm coming over, Vanessa said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Her voice was even, no performance in it. I'm coming over. She arrived 40 minutes later with nothing in her hands. No food, no flowers, no props, none of the gestures that people reached for when they were uncomfortable with the weight of someone else's emergency. Just herself. In the coat she always wore, slightly windburned from the walk from where she'd parked. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a moment. Tell me what you know, she said finally. So he told her. All of it. The medical details, the timeline, the surgeon Bay had recommended, the projected costs, the calculation he'd been running in his head since he left the parking lot of Bay's office, the gap between what he had and what the procedure would require, the specific gap that had existed between every difficult thing and his ability to meet it for 4 years running. Vanessa listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't interject with reassurances, didn't reach across the table to touch his hand in the way that would have made the conversation about comfort rather than information. She let him put it all on the table and looked at it with him. When he was done, she said, I want to help pay for it. No. Mason. I said no. His voice came out sharper than he intended, and he took a breath. I'm sorry. That came out. I heard the word. You don't have to apologize for it. She held his gaze. Can I ask why? He looked at the table. The words were tangled in the part of himself that had been working independently and on his own terms for 4 years. The part that had rebuilt something out of the wreckage on his own because the alternative was accepting that he couldn't, that he'd needed rescuing. Because she's my daughter, he said, and that makes her my responsibility. And I can't, he stopped. I can't be a person who can't handle his own life. You're a person who needs help with something expensive, she said. That's not the same thing. It feels the same. I know it does. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm not trying to make you owe me something. I'm not. She stopped. When she started again, her voice was slightly different, less composed, more real. I'm scared too, Mason. I've been scared since you called, and I've been sitting here for an hour wanting to do the thing I know how to do, which is solve the problem, and you won't let me solve the problem, and I understand why you won't, but I'm still scared. He looked at her. She matters to me, Vanessa said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost something. You both matter to me, and I know that's complicated, and I know we haven't said what this is yet. But I'm sitting here and your daughter needs something, and I have the means to give it, and you won't let me. And all I know is that it feels like the wrong call, Mason. It feels like pride in the wrong place. He sat with that. She was right. He knew she was right. He'd known it before she said it, which was part of why it landed. I'll figure out the financing, he said finally. There are options, payment plans. The hospital has a hardship program. I know. And I can pick up more hours at the warehouse through December. I know. I'm not saying I won't accept help. I'm saying, he looked at her. I need to do as much of this myself as I can. Do you understand that? She looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said. I understand that. And if I get to a point where I can't, I'll be here, she said simply. He nodded. The kitchen was quiet around them, the refrigerator humming, Emma's drawings on the door, the badge hanging by the front entrance where Emma had told him to put it. After a while, Vanessa said, Can I stay until she wakes up? I want to see her in the morning. He looked at her. Yeah, he said, you can stay. She slept on the couch that night with a blanket that had cartoon planets on it, because it was the only spare blanket Mason owned. And in the morning, when Emma padded out in her pajamas and found Vanessa in the kitchen, making coffee with the uncertain competence of someone operating an unfamiliar machine, Emma didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, Do you want me to show you where the sugar is? Vanessa looked at her. Something crossed her face, a small, genuine fracture in the composure, the briefest flash of something that might have been close to relief. Yeah, she said. I'd really like that. Emma opened the cabinet and pointed. Second shelf. The white container. Not the brown one. That's salt, and Dad never moved it back after he made the rice thing. Vanessa found the right container. Emma climbed up onto the counter stool and watched her. Are you staying for breakfast? If that's okay. Emma looked at her with the assessing expression. Dad makes good eggs, she said. but he makes them the boring way. I can show you the way with the hot sauce if you want something better. I want something better, Vanessa said. Emma nodded. Good choice, she said, and climbed down to help. Across the city that morning, Mason was already at Northern Metro before rounds, standing in the corridor outside a room where a 9-year-old with a heart condition was having a bad night, talking the overnight nurse through a medication adjustment with the calm, specific authority of someone who remembered what they were made for. The badge was around his neck. His hands were steady, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where he kept the things he didn't say out loud, he was doing the math. Not just the money, not just the surgery, not just the impossible arithmetic of the next 6 months, but a different calculation entirely. The kind that doesn't have clean numbers. The kind where you're trying to figure out how much of yourself you're willing to risk on the possibility that this time things might not fall apart. He didn't have the answer yet, but he was, for the first time in 4 years, genuinely asking the question. The December that followed was the hardest month Mason Reed had experienced since the first December without Sarah, and that was saying something, because that December had been the kind of hard that left marks. He was running on 5 hours of sleep on a good night. The warehouse had picked up seasonal volume, which meant extra shifts were available, which meant he was taking everyone he could get while simultaneously maintaining his 2 days a week at Northern Metro, while simultaneously managing Emma's pre-surgical appointments, while simultaneously trying to be present enough at home that Emma didn't absorb the particular frequency of adult stress that children pick up the way dogs hear high pitches. Not consciously, but in the body, in the way they go slightly quieter and slightly more watchful than usual. Emma had gone slightly quieter and slightly more watchful than usual. She didn't say much about the surgery. She asked occasional technical questions. She had inherited from somewhere in the genetic chain a preference for precise information over vague reassurance, and Mason answered them honestly at the level she could process, which required a specific kind of care. Too much detail, and you handed a 7-year-old the full weight of something she wasn't built to carry yet. Too little, and she'd construct something in the gap, which was frequently worse than the truth. Will it hurt? She'd asked him on a Tuesday evening in early December. After, yeah, for a while. But they're going to give you medicine for that. Will you be there when I wake up? I'll be in the building the whole time, and the first face you see when you open your eyes will be mine. She'd absorbed this. What about Vanessa? He'd looked at her. Do you want her there? Do you? Emma had considered it with the gravity she applied to important decisions. Yes, she said. I want her there too. He'd told Vanessa that same night, and Vanessa had said okay in the quiet, specific way that meant she understood the weight of what was being offered and wasn't going to make a performance out of accepting it. The surgery was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. The surgeon was a woman named Dr. Priya Nathanson. No relation to Vanessa's Priya, though Mason had done a brief internal double take when Vanessa mentioned the coincidence, who had a reputation that matched Bay's recommendation exactly. Technically exceptional, genuinely good with kids, the kind of surgeon who called her patients by name rather than diagnosis. Mason had met with Nathanson twice. The second meeting, Nathanson had asked him halfway through the clinical discussion if he was medical, and he'd said yes this time. Rather than, I have some training, and something about saying it out loud in that room had felt like a door closing on the person he'd been pretending to be for the past few years, and opening on something slightly more honest. The money remained the problem it had always been. He'd worked through the hospital's hardship program. Northern Metro had a good one, better than he'd expected, and the caseworker had been practical and kind and hadn't made him feel like a failure for being there. The program covered a significant portion. His savings, such as they were, covered another portion. The gap was not catastrophic, but it was real, and real gaps had real consequences. He'd applied for 2 medical financing programs and been accepted to one with an interest rate that was reasonable by the standards of medical debt, which meant still painful but survivable. He'd done the math, reorganized it, done it again. He knew the number. He carried it the way you carry uncomfortable knowledge, not in the front of your mind, but always accessible, always there when you reached for it. And then, the second week of December, Vanessa did something that he didn't find out about until a week after she did it. And when he found out, they had the first real fight of whatever it was they were. He found out from Priya, Vanessa's Priya, not the surgeon, who mentioned it in passing while delivering a document to Vanessa's office during a Thursday coffee that Mason had joined at the office rather than the diner because Vanessa had back-to-back meetings, and this was the only gap in her day. Priya had come in to get a signature, noticed Mason sitting across from Vanessa with a coffee, and said with the tone of someone who assumed everyone in the room shared the same information. The Nathanson surgical deposit cleared this morning, by the way, she confirmed. A small silence. Vanessa signed the document without looking up. Mason looked at Vanessa. Priya, who had 4 years of experience reading rooms that contained Vanessa Hale, understood immediately that she had contributed to a situation and retreated with professional efficiency. The office door closed. Mason set down his coffee cup. He did it carefully, which was a sign that he was controlling something. "You paid the surgical deposit," he said. Vanessa set down the pen. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." He looked at her. He was working to keep his voice level, and the effort of it was visible. "Why?" "Because you would have said no." "That's exactly why you should have told me." "Mason?" "No." He stood up, not dramatically. He didn't push the chair back or raise his voice. He just stood, because sitting felt wrong for what he was trying to say. "I told you specifically. I told you I needed to do as much of this myself as I could. I told you I would ask if I needed to. I was explicit about it." "The deposit deadline was last week," she said. "You were working 4 warehouse shifts and 2 hospital days, and you hadn't slept properly, and that's not your decision to make. Someone had to. It's Emma's surgery," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on Emma's name, just for a moment, and he controlled it. "She's my daughter. Her care is my responsibility. You don't get to step in and do something this significant without talking to me first." Vanessa was very still in her chair. She had the expression of someone who knew they'd done something wrong and was holding on to the reasons they'd done it anyway, which was not quite the same thing as not regretting it. "You're right," she said. "I should have told you." "Yeah, I was watching you run yourself into the ground, and She stopped. When she started again, there was less composure in it, more of the actual thing underneath. "I was scared. I was scared you were going to collapse before the surgery happened, or that you were going to let the deadline pass because you couldn't bear to not be the one to cover it, and Emma was going to—" She pressed her fingers to the edge of the desk. "I panicked, and I did the thing I do, which is fix the financial problem, and I did it without asking because I knew you'd say no." "You knew I'd say no," he repeated, "and you did it anyway." "Yes. That's not okay, Vanessa." "I know it's not." The silence between them had weight. Not the comfortable silence of people who knew each other well enough to be quiet together, but the friction weight of something that had to be worked through rather than around. "She's not a problem for you to solve," he said finally. "She's a person. She's my person, and I am—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm already terrified of what it means that she matters to you. I'm terrified of what it means that you matter to us. Because the last person who mattered to us—" He didn't finish the sentence. Vanessa looked at him. "I'm not Sarah," she said quietly. Not as a correction, not as a defense, just as a fact she was putting on the table. "I know you're not, and I'm not going anywhere." Her voice was still even, but it cost her something this time. "I want to say that clearly. Whatever this is, however long it takes for you to figure out what you want it to be, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long time. "You can't promise that," he said. "I know I can't." She met his eyes. "I'm promising it anyway." The office was very quiet. Outside the window, the December city was doing its gray afternoon thing, indifferent and ongoing. "I'm going to pay you back," he said. "The deposit, whatever portion it was, I'm going to pay it back." "You don't—" "I'm going to pay it back," he said again, and his voice had the quality of something non-negotiable. "Not because I think you need the money, because I need it to be a debt I'm settling rather than a gift I'm receiving. Do you understand the difference?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I understand the difference." "Then we're okay," he said. "But don't do that again. Don't make decisions about Emma without me." "I won't," she said. And then, "I'm sorry." He picked up his coffee cup, sat back down. The chair was slightly uncomfortable. A nice chair, the kind that looked better than it functioned, which was true of a lot of expensive things. He shifted and found a workable position. "How much was the deposit?" he said. She told him. He looked at his coffee. "Okay," he said. "Give me 6 months. Take whatever time you need," she said. "There's no interest." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Of course there isn't. January was cold the way the city got cold when it meant it, the kind that crept under the edge of your coat and found the gap between your collar and your jaw and stayed there. Mason drove Emma to Northern Metro on a Tuesday morning before dawn, both of them quiet in the truck, in the particular way of people sharing a difficult thing without talking about it directly. Emma had her stuffed rabbit in her lap, the same one she'd had since she was 3, worn soft from years of handling, one ear slightly misshapen from a washing machine incident when she was 4. She'd decided the rabbit should come because, she explained, the rabbit had been to the hospital before when she'd had her tonsils out, and had demonstrated good behavior and therefore earned the right to return. Mason had agreed that these were valid criteria. They checked in at 5:45 a.m. The pre-op nurses were good, efficient and kind in the manner of people who had walked hundreds of families through this specific morning and knew exactly how to make it slightly less terrible without pretending it wasn't what it was. Emma changed into the hospital gown with the cartoon animals on it and sat on the pre-op bed and looked around the room with the assessing expression that she deployed on new environments. "It smells like the other hospital," she said. "They all smell about the same. Is Dr. Nathanson nice?" "I've met her twice. She's good." "That's not what I asked." He looked at his daughter. "Yes," he said. "She's nice." Emma seemed satisfied with this. She held the rabbit in both hands and looked at the door. "Is Vanessa here?" "She's in the waiting area. She'll be here when you wake up." "Can she come in now?" He hesitated, not because he didn't want Vanessa there, but because the hesitation had become a reflex, the small protective pause before each step deeper into something he didn't have a map for. He recognized it. He made the conscious decision to override it. "I'll get her," he said. Vanessa was in the waiting area in the chair closest to the door to pre-op, in jeans and a sweater rather than the work clothes Mason usually saw her in, which made her look different, more like a person and less like a version of herself that had been polished for public consumption. She was holding a paper coffee cup that she'd barely touched, and looking at the middle distance in the way of someone whose thoughts were somewhere other than the room. She looked up when Mason appeared. "She's asking for you," he said. Vanessa set the cup down and stood up in one motion. They walked back into pre-op together, and Emma looked up from the bed and said hi with the easy directness of someone whose emotional processing was more efficient than the adults around her. And Vanessa crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed, and Emma handed her the rabbit. "Can you hold him?" Emma said. "He gets nervous." "I'll take good care of him," Vanessa said. "He likes it when you talk to him." "What should I talk to him about?" Emma thought about it. "Tell him about the anglerfish," she said. "I told him, but he doesn't fully get it. He needs to hear it from a different person." "Okay," Vanessa said. She held the rabbit in her lap and looked at it with complete seriousness. "So," she said quietly to the rabbit, "the anglerfish. Let me tell you some things." Mason stood at the foot of the bed and watched his daughter watch Vanessa talk to her rabbit, and the terror and the love were so entirely tangled together in his chest at that moment that he couldn't have separated them if he tried. He didn't try. Dr. Nathanson came in at 6:15, spent 20 minutes with them, answered Emma's detailed list of questions with the patience of someone who'd been told to expect detailed questions and had genuinely prepared for them, and then the anesthesiology team arrived, and it was time. Emma looked at Mason. "You'll be here," she said. "I'll be here." "First face." "First face," he confirmed. She looked at Vanessa. "You too?" Vanessa held her gaze. "Me too," she said. Emma nodded. She lay back against the pillow and held Mason's hand and closed her eyes, and Mason stood beside her bed and held on. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Mason knew this because he counted. Not continuously, he sat in the surgical family waiting room and read 3 pages of a book he'd brought and retained none of it, and drank 2 cups of coffee that tasted like nothing, and walked the length of the corridor 6 times, and sat down and stood up, and Vanessa was there through all of it, in the steady, uncomplicated way of someone who understood that presence was the thing required and not performance. She didn't tell him it would be fine. She didn't reach for optimism that neither of them could verify. She sat beside him and was there. And when he stood up to walk again, she stood up too and walked with him. And when he sat, she sat, and they didn't talk much. And when they did, it was about small things. Emma's recent anglerfish phase. A patient at Northern Metro named Marcus who'd sent Mason a drawing through the hospital mail system. The fact that the waiting room had a coffee machine but no tea, which Vanessa found inexplicable. At one point he said, out of nowhere, "She would have liked you." Vanessa looked at him. "Sarah," he said. She had very strong opinions about people. It took her about 45 seconds to decide about someone, and she was almost always right. He looked at the corridor wall. "She would have liked the way you listen. She was always telling me I didn't listen enough. She would have liked someone who proved her point." A beat. "I listen too much sometimes," Vanessa said. "I use it to avoid talking." "I know. That's a different problem." "It is," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth being liked by." "She was," he said simply. At 4 hours and 8 minutes, Dr. Nathanson came through the door in her scrubs, and Mason stood up before she'd fully crossed the room, and she smiled. Not the performed reassurance smile, but the actual one, the one that came from a good outcome, and said, "She did well. Everything went as planned. She's in recovery and asking for her rabbit." Mason sat back down. He put his face in his hands for approximately 10 seconds, not crying, or not exactly, not in the conventional sense, just the physical release of 4 hours of held tension finding a way out of his body through the only exit available. Vanessa put her hand on his back. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there and left it. He sat up. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He turned to Dr. Nathanson. "When can I see her? Give recovery 10 minutes to get her settled, and then we'll bring you back." He nodded. And then, because it had to be said, he looked at Nathanson and said, "Thank you." Nathanson looked at him with the expression of someone who understood exactly what those two words were carrying. "She's going to be fine, Dr. Reed," she said. "Go be with your daughter." Emma's recovery was 4 days inpatient and then home, which Mason had prepared for with the particular efficiency of someone who had identified the task and executed it entirely to avoid examining the feelings underneath. He'd rearranged Emma's room to minimize the need for her to climb or reach for things. He'd stocked the refrigerator with everything she'd eat during recovery. Applesauce, the specific crackers she liked, the soup recipe he'd gotten from Mrs. Okafor, which Emma had declared superior to all other soups, a conclusion Mrs. Okafor had received with great satisfaction. Vanessa had come to the hospital every day. Not for long, not in the way that crowded the room. An hour in the afternoon, sometimes 2. She'd brought Emma 2 things, a new small notebook and a set of drawing pens, and the collected marine biology book that Emma had mentioned wanting approximately 4 weeks ago in a way she'd probably thought no adult was tracking. Emma had opened the book with the reverence of someone receiving a significant object. "There's a whole chapter on anglerfish," Emma said. "I know," Vanessa said. "I checked." "You checked?" "Before I bought it. I wanted to make sure." Emma held the book and looked at Vanessa with an expression that was, for a 7-year-old recovering from open heart surgery, remarkably composed and also unmistakably emotional in a way she was trying to manage. "That was good," Emma said finally. "Good research." "I learned from watching you," Vanessa said. Emma turned to the anglerfish chapter. Mason stood in the doorway of Emma's hospital room and watched this and felt the thing in his chest that had been living there for months. Not terror now, not grief, but something more complicated and more hopeful and more frightening than either of those, take up more space. He was still not ready to call it by its name, but he was getting closer. Bummed. The night Vanessa first stayed at the apartment after Emma came home from the hospital was not planned as a significant event. It evolved the way real things often did, out of something practical rather than something decided. Emma had been home for 5 days. She was recovering well, faster than projected, with the physical resilience of the young, though she was frustrated by her activity restrictions in the way of a child who was used to moving through the world at full speed. She'd been given a sticker chart to track her recovery milestones, which she was managing with the same systematic intensity she applied to the honey stand rankings. And she'd already had 2 negotiation sessions with Mason about whether certain activities qualified for milestone status. The evening in question, Mason had come home from a warehouse shift. He was still doing 2 a week, the financial math still requiring it. At 11 p.m., 8 hours after he'd left, which was a 12-hour day on top of a hospital morning. And he was running at the specific depletion level that went past tired and into something closer to transparent. He could feel his own edges, the slight unreliability of his attention, the way certain thoughts weren't quite finishing themselves. Vanessa had been at the apartment for the afternoon. She told him she'd come by to sit with Emma, which was true. But the other truth was that she'd arrived at 3 and Emma was asleep by 8:30, and Vanessa had spent the intervening hours cleaning his kitchen with the focused quiet of someone who needed to do something with their hands, and then reading on the couch, and then falling asleep on the couch at some point before 11, because when Mason came through the door, she was still there. She woke up when she heard his key in the lock, that immediate alertness of someone sleeping lightly, and sat up and said, slightly disoriented, "Is Emma?" "She's fine," he said. "She's been asleep for hours." Vanessa looked around the apartment with the slightly blurry expression of someone putting together where they were. Then she looked at Mason, who had put his jacket on the hook and was standing in the entryway looking like a man who had reached the functional limit of vertical. "Sit down," she said. "I'm okay." "Mason, sit down." He sat down at the kitchen table, not because she'd told him to, but because she was right, and his body had decided the option was available and acted on it before his pride could object. She went to the kitchen and made tea, which she'd learned to make in his kitchen over the past several weeks and still did slightly wrong in a way that produced something drinkable, but not quite what he'd make himself. She put the mug in front of him and sat across from him. "How much did you sleep last night?" she asked. 4 hours. "And the night before? Similar?" "Mason, I know," he said. "I know. After January, things get..." He rubbed his face with both hands. "The warehouse winds down after the holidays. The hours will drop. I'll catch up." She looked at him for a long moment, not with frustration, with something more like pain, the specific pain of watching someone run themselves down and being unable to completely stop it. "Let me take some of the warehouse shifts," she said. He looked up. "What?" "Obviously not literally," she said, "but let me..." She stopped, tried again more carefully, in the way she'd learned to approach this particular subject. "You told me you'd ask when you needed to. I'm not offering to take over. I'm asking if there's something specific, something bounded, that I can do that would let you sleep more than 4 hours. He looked at her. "Grocery shopping," she said. "Picking Emma up from her follow-up appointments when you're at the warehouse. Small things. Things that don't feel like charity." She said the word with precision, acknowledging the weight of it. Things that feel like what people do when they're in each other's lives. He was quiet for a moment. "We're in each other's lives," he said. "Yes," she said. "We are." He wrapped both hands around the mug. The tea was too weak. She'd steeped it wrong again. But it was warm, and it was there. "Okay," he said. "The Wednesday follow-up. I've got a double shift. If you could pick her up, I'll pick her up. She'll want to stop at the farmer's market if it's not too cold. I know she will." He looked across the table at her. She was sitting in the chair she usually sat in the kitchen of his apartment, in the particular way of someone who had made themselves comfortable enough to fall asleep on his couch and wake up at 11 p.m. without feeling like they needed an excuse for being there. Her hair was slightly messy from the couch cushion. She had a book open face down on the table beside her, the spine bent back, a habit Mason found mildly offensive but had not yet said anything about. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was something else, a recognition, an acknowledgement, a small precise naming of a thing that had been accumulating for months. "Is that okay?" she asked. He looked at her. He thought about the calculation he'd been running for months. Not the financial one, the other one, the harder one. He thought about the 4-hour nights and the warehouse shifts and Emma's sticker chart and the badge by the door and Dr. Nathanson's face in the waiting room and Emma's rabbit and Vanessa talking to it in a hospital pre-op room at 6 in the morning. He thought about a mountain 8 years ago and a woman who'd fought him when he told her to stop moving. and how that had been the first time he'd known something about her that she probably didn't know about herself. "Yeah," he said, "it's okay." She nodded once. She picked up her book, fixed the bent spine with the automatic guilt of someone who knew they did it wrong, and opened it back to her page. They sat in the quiet kitchen together while the city went about its late-night business outside, and Mason drank his 2-week tea and felt the specific weight of the day leaving his body by degrees, and the particular quality of the quiet between them was the kind that didn't require filling. At some point he said, "The book thing." She looked up. "When you read, you crack the spine back," he said. "It damages it." She looked at the book. "I know. I've always done it. It's a bad habit." "It is." She looked at him over the book. "Are you going to tell me to stop?" He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm just noting it." The corner of her mouth moved. "Noted," she said. She went back to her book. He finished his tea. Outside, December did its cold, indifferent thing, and inside the small apartment on the west side of the city, something had quietly shifted into a different configuration, not complete, not settled, still complicated in all the ways that real things are complicated, but real, undeniably, uncomplicatedly real. Damn. He was on the phone with Elaine Harlan in the second week of January, when she said the thing that had been building in the background of every conversation they'd had since November. "The surgical fellowship slot," she said. "It opens in March, full time." He was quiet. "I know it's early," she said. "I know you just started the consulting work. I know there are She paused. "Personal considerations. Emma's surgery is the third week of January." "I know. I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm asking you to know it exists." He sat with that. The surgical fellowship. The thing the other version of his life had been building toward. The thing that had been interrupted and buried and carried in the part of himself he'd mostly stopped looking at, because looking at it hurt in a way that wasn't useful. "The full program," he said. "Not the consulting arrangement." "The full program," Elaine confirmed. "Or a phased transition. We can structure it to accommodate—" She paused. "A single parent schedule. We're more flexible than we used to be." "Why?" "Because we lost good people by not being flexible, and we finally had the honest conversation about what that cost us." A pause. What it cost the kids. He thought about Marcus, about Lily and her rabbit, about a 9-year-old whose heart had been repaired by someone who knew what they were doing and had come back to it because someone had been paying attention. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Elaine said. He thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about it while he drove Emma to her pre-surgical consultation. He thought about it while he made dinner and while Emma narrated her ongoing research into deep-sea bioluminescence and while he lay in the dark after she was asleep and the apartment was doing its nighttime sounds. He was still thinking about it on the rainy evening 3 weeks after Emma's surgery when he drove to Vanessa's building and took the elevator to her floor and knocked on her door. And she opened it with the slightly confused expression of someone who hadn't known he was coming, and before she could ask, he said, "I need to tell you something." She stepped back to let him in. He was wet from the rain. He'd parked 2 blocks away and walked without thinking about it, which he'd done twice with her now, the walking in the rain thing, and there was probably something to note about the pattern. She handed him a towel without comment. He stood in her apartment, which was large and expensive and beautiful, in the way that things are when someone has built something significant and then filled the space of it with objects rather than people. And he felt, as he sometimes did here, the particular awareness of how different their circumstances were, and how that difference existed in every dimension: financial, experiential, the fundamental texture of daily life, and also how that difference had stopped feeling like a barrier somewhere over the past few months, and had started feeling like something they could simply account for and work with. "There's a fellowship slot at Northern Metro," he said. "Full surgical program. It opens in March." She looked at him. "I want to take it," he said. "I think I've been wanting to take it for longer than I've been willing to say." He looked at her. "But it means the schedule changes. The warehouse is gone. The consulting arrangement transitions to a full program, and there are nights when I'll be in the hospital until midnight, and Emma needs—" "I'll be there," she said. He looked at her. "Not as a substitute," she said carefully, not as a replacement for anything, but as someone who is in her life, who can be there when you can't. That's a significant commitment, he said. I know what it is, she said. He looked at her for a long time. The rain was audible against her windows, the city sounds filtering up from 32 floors below. She was standing in her own apartment in the cashmere sweater she wore at home when she wasn't performing being Vanessa Hale. And she was looking at him with the direct, steady attention that he had come to understand was the truest version of her. Not the polished executive, not the untouchable person in profiles and boardrooms, but this. A woman standing in her living room in the rain sound, being honest about what she was willing to give. I'm scared, he said. I know, she said. Not of you, he clarified. He tried to find the specific shape of it. Of doing this again. Letting someone matter enough that losing them would... He stopped. You know what I mean. I do, she said quietly. I'm scared too, for different reasons. What are your reasons? She looked at him. That you'll look at me one day and see everything I've built and decide that's what I am. Her voice was even, but it took work. That you'll decide I'm transactional. That the fear you have about people offering things with strings, that you'll apply it to me retroactively, and I won't be able to convince you otherwise because the evidence can be read both ways. He looked at her. I'm not here because of what you were, she said. I'm not here because of the mountain or the gala or what you could become. I'm here because of Tuesday night dinners and farmer's market honey and the way you talk to your daughter like she's a complete person. I'm here because you're the only person I've met in a very long time who treats me like a woman sitting at a table rather than a brand presenting a value proposition. She paused. I'm here because you told me to be quiet and follow you in a hotel kitchen, and it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years. The rain came down against the windows. He crossed the room. He took her hand, both of them, held them in his the way he'd learned she sometimes needed, her cold hands, the thing Emma had noticed first and drawn in blue crayon and remembered to put in the picture. And he held them until he felt the warmth move through. Stay quiet, he said softly. Follow me. She looked up at him. Something in her face had let go. The last bit of composure, the performance layer, the version of herself she presented to rooms that required her to be formidable rather than real. Where are we going? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in 4 years, the calculation he'd been running, the one about risk and loss and whether the math ever worked out, landed on a different answer. Not a certain answer, not a guaranteed one, but the kind of answer that was honest about the odds and chose the thing anyway. I don't know exactly, he said, but I want to go there with you. She held his hands and the rain came down and the city carried on outside 32 floors below, and in the warm light of her apartment, something settled between them. Not quietly and not perfectly, but the way real things settle. Imperfect, significant, and entirely worth the cost of getting there. March came in the way it usually did in the city, not cleanly, not with any of the symbolic freshness that people like to assign to seasonal transitions, but gradually and inconsistently, a few warm days followed by a week of cold, followed by rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet. The kind of weather that kept you honest about expectations. Mason started the full fellowship program on a Monday. He drove to Northern Metro in the dark at 5:40 a.m., parked in the structure he now knew well enough to navigate on autopilot, and walked through the main entrance with his badge around his neck and a coffee from the cart on Clement Street still warm in his hand. The overnight resident he was relieving at 6 was a 26-year-old named Asha, who had the specific quality of exhaustion that came from a good shift. Tired but satisfied. The kind of tired that meant something had happened and been handled. She gave him the handoff in the corridor with the efficiency of someone who had learned to communicate the essential things fast and trust the receiving physician to ask questions if needed. Room 4 has the overnight fever, down to 99.2, responding to treatment. Room 7's post-op day 2, vital stable, mom's anxious, she'll want to talk. Room 9 is the new admit from overnight, 8-year-old, suspected appendicitis. Surgery consult's already been paged. Got it, Mason said. Go, sleep. Already gone, she said, and was. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his coffee and the handoff notes and the quiet hum of a hospital ward transitioning between night and morning, and he felt Not happiness, exactly, because the word was too simple for what the sensation actually was, but something close to rightness. The specific feeling of being in a place that used its specific version of you. He'd spent 4 years in places that used a general version of him, a body that could lift and carry and show up, a mind that could follow instructions and solve practical problems. And this was different in a way that went all the way down. He went to check on Room 7's anxious mother first, because she'd been there all night, and anxiety compounds with exhaustion in ways that become their own problem. The mother's name was Diane. Her son was 6, recovering from a procedure the day before, and she had the look of a woman who had been awake for 20 hours running worst-case scenarios. Mason pulled a chair up beside her rather than standing, which took 30 seconds and changed the entire register of the conversation. "Tell me what you're worried about specifically," he said. She looked at him like she hadn't expected the word specifically. "Everything," she said. "Okay, let's start with the thing that's loudest." She told him. He listened. He answered each specific fear with the specific information that addressed it, not with the blanket reassurances that felt good in the moment and produced more anxiety when they turned out to be inadequate. It took 12 minutes. By the end, Diane's shoulders had dropped approximately 2 inches. "Thank you," she said. "The last doctor who came in, he was kind, but he talked at me. You talked with me." "My daughter was a patient here once," Mason said simply. "I know what the chair feels like." He went to the rest of his rooms. Emma had her 6-week post-surgical follow-up in the second week of March, and Dr. Nathanson delivered the results with the directness that Mason had come to appreciate, and Emma had come to categorize as the good kind of doctor honesty in the taxonomy she'd developed for evaluating medical professionals. "Everything looks excellent," Nathanson said, reviewing the echo results with them. "The repair's holding exactly as we'd want. No signs of residual compromise. Cardiac function is normal range for her age." She looked at Emma directly, rather than at Mason, which Emma had told him in the car on the way over was her primary criterion for a doctor being trustworthy. "You were a very good patient, Emma." "I know," Emma said. Nathanson smiled. "I'm removing the activity restriction. Gradually, let's say 2 more weeks of taking it easy, and then back to normal." Emma processed this. "Does taking it easy include gym class?" "Light activity. Gym is sometimes light. I'll leave that negotiation to you and your father." "We're going to negotiate," Emma told Mason. "I know," he said. Outside the hospital, in the parking structure with the gray March light filtering through the concrete levels, Emma walked beside Mason with her hands in her coat pockets and said nothing for a moment. He was used to her silences by now, had been studying them for 7 years and could distinguish between the working something out silence and the avoiding something silence and the just being comfortable with quiet silence. This was the first kind. He waited. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Is my heart fixed?" "Yes," he said. "It's fixed." She walked another few steps. "Like permanently?" "Nathanson will monitor it, but the repair is designed to be permanent, yes." "So I'm not going to die from it?" He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked up at him with the specific expression of a child who had been carrying a question for a very long time and had finally found the configuration that allowed it to come out. She wasn't panicking, she was just asking, which was somehow harder to witness than panic would have been. He crouched down so he was at her level, right there in the parking structure on the concrete, not caring about the car exhaust and the gray light and the fact that this was not a beautiful location for a moment that mattered. "No," he said. "You're not going to die from it. Not from this." "You can't actually promise that," she said, with the precision that he'd both cultivated in her and was occasionally leveled by. "No," he admitted. "I can't promise the future. Nobody can. What I can promise is that right now, today, your heart is fixed and your body is strong, and you have decades of things ahead of you." He looked at her. "And whatever comes, I will be the person figuring it out with you, every time." She looked at him for a moment. "And Vanessa?" He held her gaze. "That's a question I want to answer properly," he said. "Can we talk about it tonight? At home?" She studied him. Something in his expression must have given something away, because she tilted her head slightly in the way she did when she was processing more than she was showing. "Okay," she said, and started walking again toward the truck. He stood up and followed her, and the particular quality of what he was feeling in that moment, the relief and the love and the weight of everything it had cost to get here, and the awareness of everything still ahead, was not the kind of thing that resolved into a clean emotion. It was several things at once, tangled together, the way the real and important things always were. He was learning to be okay with that. He'd been planning it for 3 weeks, not elaborately. Mason was not a man who planned elaborate things, and Vanessa was not a woman who would have responded well to elaborate, which was one of the specific compatibilities he'd come to understand about the two of them. She was uncomfortable with grand gestures performed at her, had told him once, obliquely, that her experience of grand gestures had almost always been about the person making them rather than the person receiving them. He'd filed that away. What he'd planned was small and specific, and he thought honest. He'd talked to Emma about it 10 days ago. Not to ask permission, she was 7, he was her parent, but because she was a person who deserved to know what was coming, who had earned, through years of paying close attention and asking precise questions and loving without conditions, the right to be part of this conversation before it happened. He told her on a Sunday morning, at the kitchen table, over the specific mediocre pancakes he made every Sunday that Emma had never complained about, because she understood pancakes were not his strength and appreciated the effort anyway. "I want to ask Vanessa to marry me," he said. Emma had stopped mid-bite. She'd set her fork down with the deliberateness of someone who needed both hands free for thinking. He'd waited. "Are you going to be her husband?" she'd said finally. "If she says yes." "What would I be?" He'd looked at her. "What do you want to be?" She'd thought about it for a long time. He hadn't rushed it. Some questions deserved the full weight of consideration, even, especially, from 7-year-olds. "She's not my mom," Emma said. Not with grief, not with hostility, just accurate. "No," he said. "She's not. But she's something. She is." Emma had picked up her fork again, ate a bite of pancake, looked at the refrigerator where the current rotation of drawings included the one with the blue hands, which had never come down, which Mason had noticed and not mentioned. "I think she should be something that doesn't already have a word," Emma said finally. "Because all the words for it mean something else, and she's not that thing." He'd looked at his daughter. "Okay," he said. "We can work on the word." Emma had nodded, satisfied. "Does she know you're going to ask?" "No." "Is she going to say yes?" "I think so. I hope so." Emma had picked up a piece of pancake and eaten it thoughtfully. "She's going to say yes," she said, with the calm authority of someone who had already run the analysis. "She looks at you the way Mom looked at you in the pictures." He'd had to look away for a moment. "Dad?" "Yeah." "It's okay," Emma said. "Mom would want you to not be sad all the time." He'd looked back at her. "I'm not sad all the time." "Less than you used to be," she allowed. "Since Vanessa." He couldn't argue with that. The anniversary of the gala fell on a Saturday in late March. Mason had registered this fact quietly, in the private accounting he kept of things that mattered, and had said nothing about it to Vanessa, who had not mentioned it either, though he suspected she knew. They were both people who kept track of things without advertising that they did. They'd spent the day in the ordinary way of people who had stopped performing their time together and had started simply occupying it. Emma's activity restriction had been lifted that week, and she had celebrated by immediately asking to go to the farmer's market, which had been running since the new season started. And so the three of them went in the morning with reusable bags and the specific agenda of a child who had been planning her honey acquisition strategy for weeks. The honey stand woman, her name was Rosa. She'd been at the market for 11 years and had been watching Emma's weekly purchasing patterns with the fond attention of a grandmother, had saved back 2 jars of a new late-season wildflower variety that she'd told Emma about the week before. Emma received them like small treasures. "Dad," she announced, holding one jar up to the weak March sunlight, "I think this might be the best one." "You say that every time there's a new one, because every time there's a new one, it might be. That's how you find out." Vanessa was standing at Mason's shoulder, slightly too close to be accidental and not close enough to be a statement. The comfortable proximity of two people who had stopped maintaining the performance of casual distance. She tilted her head toward him and said quietly, "She has a point." "She usually does," Mason said. "It's exhausting." "I heard that," Emma said, without turning around. They bought the honey and the good bread with the seeds on top, and a small bunch of flowers that Emma picked with criteria that remained entirely her own, and they walked back to the apartment through the particular early spring morning that was cold, but not cold enough to require misery about it, and Emma carried her honey bag with both hands like it contained something precious, which to her it did. After lunch, Emma fell asleep on the couch, the first genuinely relaxed post-surgical sleep, the kind of heavy afternoon nap that meant the body was done with its emergency protocols and had returned to normal operations. Mason put a blanket over her and stood looking at her for a moment, this whole entire specific person who had been depending on him since she was born and had somehow, against significant odds, turned into someone extraordinary. He turned around and Vanessa was in the kitchen doorway watching him watch Emma. "Come outside," he said quietly. They went out to the small back area behind the apartment building. It wasn't quite a garden, more an outdoor maintenance space that the building super had, over years of tenants asking, gradually made into something almost pleasant with container plants and string lights that someone had hung years ago and never taken down. The lights were off in the daylight, but they were there, looped between the hooks on the brick wall, waiting. Vanessa stood with her coat on and looked at the container plants, which were just beginning to show the first green of things that had survived winter and were cautiously reconsidering existence. "I need to tell you something," Mason said. She turned. He was standing a few feet from her, and she could see it immediately. The specific quality of a person who had decided something and arrived at the decision through a long and serious route, not nervous in the way of someone uncertain, but present in the way of someone who understood the weight of the moment and was not trying to minimize it. He didn't kneel right away. He said it first. Because that was the honest order of things, he thought. You said the thing before you asked the question, so the question wasn't carrying everything alone. "I've been trying to figure out for a long time," he said, "whether I was allowed to want this, whether I'd used up the portion of things going right, or whether loving someone again was something that belonged to the version of my life that ended." He looked at her steadily. "I couldn't get there on my own. I needed Emma to tell me. I needed the fact of you to make the argument better than I could make it to myself." She was very still. "You didn't fix my life," he said. "I want to be specific about that. I fixed my life. You were there while I did it, which is different and is the thing I needed more than fixing. Someone there. Someone who stayed." He reached into his jacket pocket. The ring was not complicated. He wasn't a complicated person, and she wasn't someone who wanted complicated things. She'd told him once, in the kitchen over 2-week tea, that the things she'd actually wanted her whole life were embarrassingly simple, and she'd spent years constructing elaborate defenses around them, because wanting simple things felt like a vulnerability she couldn't afford. He'd heard that and filed it where he filed the important things. The ring was a single stone, clear and honest, set in a plain band that would not snag on surgical gloves or get in the way of the hands of someone who used hers to do work that mattered. He went down on one knee on the concrete of the back area with the string lights off in the daylight and the container plants coming back to life, and he looked up at her. "Stay," he said. "Not will you marry me first, but this. Stay in our lives. Stay in my life. I know it's imperfect, and I know the schedule is impossible, and I know Emma has opinions about everything, including what we have for dinner on Wednesdays." Vanessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "And I know that you had a different life planned, and this is not that life. And I'm asking you to choose this one anyway, with me." He paused. "Vanessa Hale, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. There were tears on her face. She didn't appear to have noticed them yet, which was so specifically her, the last person in the room to register her own emotional state, that he would have smiled if this hadn't been the most serious thing he'd asked anyone, since he asked Sarah the same question in a different city, in a different life that had still, somehow, led here. "Yes," she said, "before you finish asking. Yes." He stood up. She took his face in both her cold hands, and they were cold. They were always cold, the thing Emma had noticed first, the thing that had made it into the drawing, and she held it the way you hold something you're done pretending you don't need. Behind them, from the open window of the apartment, came a voice. "She said yes," Emma announced, loud enough for the entire building to hear. "I told you, Zot." They were married in September. Not in a ballroom, not in a venue that required a seating chart with 17 categories of stakeholder. Vanessa had told Mason, 2 days after the engagement, that she wanted something small, and he'd looked at her and said, "How small?" And she'd said, "Small enough that everyone there actually knows us." And he'd said, "That's very small." And she'd said, "I know." And they'd been in agreement, 31 people. The ceremony was held in the garden of a small property outside the city that belonged to a friend of Mason's for medical school. An actual garden, the kind with grass that was slightly uneven in places, and roses that had been allowed to grow in their own direction, rather than being disciplined into formal arrangements. The chairs were mismatched because they'd rented from 2 different places due to a scheduling mix-up that Mason had handled the week before the wedding with the calm competence of someone who had learned that perfect logistics were not the point. Mrs. Okafor was there, in a purple dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and told Mason was very expensive, which he suspected was not entirely true, but received with the appropriate gravity. Gerald from the hotel, who had turned out to be an ongoing figure in their lives through the strange continuity of how people accumulate, sat in the 3rd row and cried before the ceremony even started, which he would deny later. Dr. Elaine Harlan was there. She sat beside James Whitfield, who had come at Vanessa's invitation and spent most of the reception telling people about a conversation he'd had with Vanessa at 7:50 a.m. that had confirmed, as he put it, with the satisfied air of someone whose read on a situation had proven out, that some things were worth disrupting a perfectly good morning for. Priya, Vanessa's Priya, was there, and spent the ceremony with the expression of someone watching something they'd understood was coming before the principals had understood it themselves, which was accurate. Emma was the flower girl. She had opinions about this role. She'd negotiated the flower distribution methodology with Mason over the course of 2 weeks, ultimately arriving at a system where she distributed petals in deliberate, considered placements rather than the traditional scattering, because scattering seemed wasteful, and also, she felt, the people in the chairs deserved to see what they were getting. Mason had agreed that this approach had merit. Vanessa had agreed that she was completely unsurprised. Emma walked the aisle ahead of them with the focused intensity of someone executing a plan, and halfway down she looked back over her shoulder at Mason and Vanessa, and whatever she saw on their faces made her grin. The full, uncalculated grin of a child who knows that a thing has landed the way it should. And then she turned back to the business of flower placement and continued. The ceremony itself was short. They'd both wanted short. The officiant was a friend of Vanessa's from her early company years, now a semi-retired attorney who had known Vanessa when she was building Hale Energy in a 2-desk office, and had watched her become something significant and was one of the very few people who had the pre-success version of her on record. He said, "Before the vows, I've known this woman for 17 years, and I've never seen her choose something the way she chose this. Vanessa makes decisions carefully and quickly, and with the confidence of someone who has already run the analysis. But with Mason and Emma, she didn't analyze. She just went. And anyone who knows her understands that's the rarest thing." Vanessa looked at her shoes for a moment. Then she looked at Mason. Mason looked back at her. They'd written their own vows, which Mason had found more difficult than any medical procedure he'd performed, partly because surgical precision felt achievable in a way that accurately describing the inside of your chest to another person did not. He'd written 7 drafts. He'd read the final one to Emma, who had told him it was good, but the part in the middle is a little slow, which he'd taken under advisement and edited. He said, "I spent 4 years believing that the second chapter of a life could only be smaller than the first. That loss does that. It makes you renegotiate downward, revise your expectations of what's possible, and call it wisdom. You proved me wrong, not by being extraordinary, though you are, but by showing up consistently. For Emma, for me, in a kitchen at 6 a.m. with a rabbit you were talking to entirely earnestly, you showed up as a person rather than an event, and that turned out to be the thing I needed most, and the thing I'd stopped believing was available." He paused. "I'm not going to promise you a life without hard things, because I've stopped making promises I can't verify. I'm going to promise you that whatever the hard things are, I will be the person standing next to you through them, and that I will never stop seeing you. Not the company, not the reputation, not the version of you that rooms expect. You." Vanessa's vows were shorter. She'd told him, when they'd compared notes, not content, but length, that she'd written a long version and cut it because most of it was about things she was afraid of. And she'd decided that what she wanted to say at this particular ceremony was not about fear, but about its opposite. She said, "I've been excellent at many things in my life. I've built something real, made decisions that mattered, worked harder than I'd recommend to anyone. But I did not know how to be in a family. I didn't understand what it felt like to be chosen for ordinary reasons. Not for what I'd accomplished, not for what I controlled, but for who I was on a Tuesday night at a kitchen table. Mason taught me that. Emma taught me that. You two are the thing I didn't know I was building toward while I was building everything else." It's all bossy show. She stopped. "I love you. I love your daughter. I am going to spend the rest of my life being worth both of those things." Emma, who was standing 4 feet to the left and processing all of this with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, reached over and took Vanessa's hand. Vanessa looked down at her. Emma had nothing to say. She just held the hand. The officiant said the words. Mason put the ring on Vanessa's finger, the plain band without the stone that she'd asked for later, separate from the engagement ring because she wanted a wedding band that she could wear in every room without thinking about it, which he'd understood immediately. She put a plain band on his finger. The officiant said, "You may—" "I know," Mason said, and Vanessa laughed, and that was the thing that everyone would remember afterward. Not the vows, which were beautiful, not the flowers, which were well placed, but the laugh, the real one, the one that came out of her without permission, unpolished and genuine and entirely her own. He kissed her. Emma cheered. Mrs. Okafor cried. Gerald, in the third row, applauded so hard his program fell off his lap. And the mismatched chairs and the slightly uneven grass and the roses growing in their own directions were not a compromise or a limitation, but the exact right thing, because the exact right things are rarely the most polished ones, and anyone who'd been paying attention to this story already knew that. The reception was in the garden and went 3 hours past when it was supposed to end because no one wanted to leave, which was, Mason thought, the best possible outcome of any gathering. He found himself at one point standing at the edge of the garden with a glass of something he'd been handed and not specifically requested, watching the party happen in front of him. Emma was somewhere near the dessert table with Rosa from the honey stand, who had been invited because Emma had insisted and no one had been able to produce a compelling argument against it. Vanessa was across the garden talking to Elaine Harlan, their heads close together in the manner of two women who had found, unexpectedly, that they had a great deal to say to each other. He stood and watched the people he'd accumulated over the course of an improbable year. The ones who'd been there at the beginning, the ones who'd come in later, the ones he'd have missed entirely if a single thread had been pulled differently. Mrs. Okafor, who had a plate of food and was telling Gerald a story that required both hands. Priya, who was talking to Asha from Northern Metro, who'd come because Mason had thought to invite the overnight residents he actually knew, on the basis that the people who showed up in the hard hours deserved to be present in the good ones too. A year ago, he'd been in a borrowed suit with a nicked jaw, holding his daughter's hand in a ballroom where nobody noticed him. He thought about that person. Not with pity, not with the condescension of hindsight, more with the specific recognition of someone looking at an earlier version of himself and understanding now what that version was carrying, the weight of it, the way it had compressed everything into function and survival, and the daily work of keeping a small person safe and loved on resources that were never quite enough. That man had deserved more than he'd allowed himself to ask for. So had the 7-year-old beside him. So had, it turned out, the woman across the garden who had built something enormous and filled the space of it with objects instead of people, and was currently laughing at something Elaine Harlan had said with the full, unguarded version of her face. He didn't think love was a reward for having suffered enough. He'd stopped believing in that kind of accounting. What he believed, what the past year had demonstrated to him in ways he hadn't been able to argue with, was simpler and harder and more worth holding on to. That the people willing to stay were the people worth finding, and that finding them required being willing to be found, and that being willing to be found required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical risk or professional excellence. It required being honest about what you needed. It required letting someone see the borrowed suit. Emma appeared at his elbow. She'd obtained a piece of cake and was eating it with the focus of someone conducting a flavor assessment. "Good party," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. "Mrs. Okafor says your soup is better than hers now." "She said that." "She said it to Rosa. I was nearby." Emma ate another bite of cake. "I think she was being generous. Hers is still better." "Agreed. Don't tell her I agreed." "Obviously." She stood beside him looking at the party. "Dad?" "Yeah." "I thought of a word," she said, "for what Vanessa is." He looked at her. "Ours," Emma said. "She's ours." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a good word," he said. "I thought so," Emma said, and finished her cake. Across the garden, Vanessa looked over and found him in the way that had become familiar over the past several months, the specific directness of someone who had stopped pretending they weren't looking. She held his gaze for a moment, and in the warm September evening light, there was something in her expression that he recognized as the true version of her, the one underneath the executive competence and the carefully maintained composure, the one he'd caught glimpses of in hotel kitchens and farmers' markets, and his own inadequate kitchen at 11 p.m. She looked like someone who was exactly where she'd decided to be. He raised his glass slightly. She turned back to Elaine Harlan, but there was something different in the line of her shoulders now, a slightly more settled quality. The particular ease of someone who knows that the person they need to find at the end of the evening is already there. It was 2 years later, at a hospital benefit, that Mason found himself in a ballroom again. This one was different from the Hargrove Gala in most visible ways. Smaller, affiliated with Northern Metro. The kind of event that was more about the work than the spectacle. But it had chandeliers, and it had people in formal wear, and it had the low, rolling hum of a room full of people who understood that they were supposed to be somewhere and be seen. And something in Mason's body registered all of that and returned, briefly and involuntarily, to a November night 2 years ago. He was standing near the far wall, out of the main current of the room, waiting for Vanessa to finish a conversation with a foundation board member who had been trying to secure her signature on something for 40 minutes and was running out of ways to ask. Emma was at home with the babysitter. She was 9 now, old enough to have opinions about babysitters, currently tolerating the one named Devin, who she described as fine, not interesting, but fine. And Mason had spent most of the car ride reviewing the chart notes he'd had open on his tablet, because there was a patient at Northern Metro, a 4-year-old named Isabel, whose case had been sitting in the front of his brain all week, in the particular way cases did when they were asking a question he hadn't answered yet. A woman appeared at his shoulder. He didn't recognize her. Middle 50s, kind face, the specific posture of someone who worked in medicine or adjacent to it. "Dr. Reed," she said. He turned. "I'm on the Northern Metro board," she said. "I've heard a lot about your work with the pediatric program. The outcomes data from the past 18 months. She shook her head. "Remarkable." "The team is excellent," he said. "I'm one component. Dr. Harlan says you're the component that changed the shape of the whole." He looked at his glass. "Dr. Harlan is generous." "Dr. Harlan is precise," the woman said. "There's a difference." She paused. "I wanted to introduce myself because I'm chairing the expansion committee for the fellowship program next year. We want to build something more significant, more permanent." She looked at him directly. "We want people who believe in what the program can be, not just what it is. I hope you'll consider being part of that conversation." He looked at her. 2 years ago, he'd been fixing a porch railing for $60. 6 months ago, he'd stood in an operating room for the first time in 4 years. Not as the primary surgeon, not yet, but as second, assisting on a case that Dr. Nathanson had invited him into with the specific intention of putting him back in a room where his full training was the thing required rather than a subset of it. He hadn't told anyone how it had felt. Not Elaine, not Vanessa, not even Emma. Some things were too internal for immediate translation, needed time to move from experience into language. What he'd felt was that he'd come back to something that was still his, even after everything that had argued otherwise. That the years in the warehouse and the handyman calls and the 4-hour nights had not taken it from him. That it had been waiting the way certain things wait. Not impatiently, not with any particular faith in the outcome, just simply still being there. "Yes," he said to the board member. "I'll be part of that conversation." She nodded, pleased, and moved on. Vanessa appeared at his side a moment later, having extracted herself from the foundation board member with the efficiency of someone who had been ending conversations she didn't want to be in for 30 years. "That looks significant," she said. "Fellowship Expansion Committee. She wants me involved." Vanessa looked at him. "Are you going to do it?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment and then she smiled. Not the public version, not the one she deployed in rooms like this. The real one, which still sometimes surprised him with its directness, the way it arrived without the usual half-second of management that went into most of her expressions. "Good," she said. They stood together at the edge of the room in the chandelier light, and the party moved around them the way it had at the Hargrove Gala 2 years ago, the same general architecture of privilege and philanthropy, and people trying to matter to each other in formal wear. But Mason Reed was not the same man who had stood in a ballroom in a borrowed suit. He was wearing a suit that fit. He was wearing the ring on his left hand. He had his Northern Metro badge in the inside pocket of his jacket because he'd come here from a late round and hadn't had time to leave it at home. His phone had a photo of Emma as the lock screen. Recent, from 2 weeks ago, Emma at the farmer's market holding a jar of honey up to the light with the expression of a scientist confirming a hypothesis, Rosa in the background grinning. He was a pediatric surgeon in a program he was helping to build. He was a husband. He was Emma's father, which had always been the most important thing and remained so without contradiction. He was a person who had survived something that compressed everything and come out the other side with specific knowledge about what mattered and what didn't, and who had stopped apologizing for the cost of getting there. None of it was smooth. None of it was the version that looked good in a brief summary. The surgery debt was almost paid, but not yet. The fellowship was demanding in ways that occasionally required negotiation and compromise, and the specific logistical creativity of a household where two demanding careers overlapped with a 9-year-old's schedule and opinions. Emma had gone through a phase in January of waking up in the night from dreams she wouldn't describe, and appearing silently in doorways, and they'd navigated that with the imperfect combination of professional guidance and parental instinct, and staying up too late and getting it partially wrong before getting it more right. Vanessa still cracked book spines. Mason still made mediocre pancakes on Sundays. They argued, occasionally, in the specific way of two people who were both accustomed to being right and had to keep renegotiating the terms of being wrong together. The honey pantry had grown to 19 jars. Emma showed no signs of slowing down. Real life had the texture of real life, resistant and specific and frequently inconvenient, occasionally beautiful in ways that arrived sideways when you weren't positioned to receive them, and not like the story you'd planned, but like the story that happened instead. "Come on," Vanessa said, and took his hand. They walked back into the party. On a Tuesday evening in October, Emma Reed sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Mason cooked, and Vanessa sat across from Emma, their running fact competition having paused while Emma finished a math problem she found insufficiently interesting. Outside, the city was doing its fall evening thing, the particular quality of October dark that arrived earlier than summer dark and had a different smell to it, something about cooling and change and the accumulated weight of a season turning over. Emma finished the math problem, looked at it, found it acceptable, and looked up. "Okay," she said. "Marine biology. My turn." "Go," Vanessa said. The mimic octopus can impersonate 15 different species. It chooses which one based on the predator. It has a different performance for different threats. Vanessa considered, "I know that there's a species of dragonfly that navigates by the stars, one of the only insects confirmed to do it." Emma wrote both facts in the notebook they kept specifically for this game. She'd been keeping it for a year and a half. It had 43 pages of facts in it. Emma had recently informed them that she intended to publish it eventually, in some form, and both adults had agreed this was entirely plausible. "That's a good one," Emma said. "Stars." "I thought so." Emma closed the notebook. She looked at Vanessa for a moment, and then at Mason, and then back at Vanessa with the expression she had when something was taking shape in her thinking. "I figured something out," she said. "What?" Mason said from the stove. "The mimic octopus," Emma said. "It changes itself depending on what's trying to hurt it, but it doesn't change what it actually is. Underneath, it's still the same thing." She paused. "I think that's what we do too. We change how we look depending on what's happening, but we don't change the underneath part. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of whatever Mason was making. Vanessa looked at Emma. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think that's right." Emma nodded, satisfied that the analysis had been confirmed, and opened her homework to the next problem. Mason looked at Vanessa over Emma's head. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The thing they'd built, out of borrowed suits and cold hands and honey jars and two-week tea and mismatched chairs and children talking to rabbits, and men who had stopped allowing themselves to want things learning how to want them again, was here. It was in this kitchen, in this specific Tuesday evening, in the fact of these three particular people occupying the same ordinary space. It was imperfect. It was real. It was, without question, enough.